My son-in-law tossed his Mercedes keys at my chest in front of 70 elite guests and ordered me to move my old truck. He laughed and called it poverty stock to impress his wealthy friends. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I simply smiled, caught the keys, and parked his car. What this arrogant man did not know was that his entire career, his massive debts, and his very future were about to land on the desk of the billionaire investor he had just treated like the help. Before I continue this story of absolute karma, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that arrogance always comes with a devastating price tag. My name is Terrence Hayes. I am 69 years old, and for the past 3 decades I have run a commercial real estate empire right here in Atlanta. I prefer to live quietly. Wealth speaks, but true power listens. That is why I still drive my 1998 Ford F-150. That truck has history. It is the vehicle my late wife Camille and I drove when we bought our very first commercial lot. The engine hums with memories of her laugh, and the worn leather seats remind me of where I came from. To me, it is a museum piece. To my daughter Jada and her husband Blake, it is an absolute embarrassment. It was a warm Saturday evening when I pulled up to their new $3 million mansion in Buckhead. The driveway was already packed with a glittering array of European luxury cars. Porsches, Range Rovers, and Teslas lined the immaculate paving stones like a high-end dealership. My old Ford, with its faded paint and minor rust spots, stood out like a sore thumb among the polished chrome and tinted windows. I parked carefully at the edge of the driveway, making sure not to block anyone in. I was carrying a housewarming gift. A beautiful vintage clock Camille had always wanted Jada to have for her first real home. I walked up the sweeping stone steps, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. I wanted to celebrate my daughter's success, even if it was largely funded by Blake's flashy and highly leveraged lifestyle. Before I could even reach the massive double doors, Blake stepped out. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than some people make in a month, holding a crystal glass of scotch. He was surrounded by a group of older white men, his firm partners and potential investors. Blake always tried a little too hard to fit in with them to prove he belonged in their exclusive club. When he saw me, his face hardened. The polite professional smile he wore for his guests vanished, replaced by a sneer of pure condescension. He marched down the steps, completely ignoring the gift in my hands. "Hey, driver!" he called out loudly. The chatter among his guests died down. 70 pairs of eyes turned to look at me, standing there in my simple slacks and button-down shirt. I stopped looking at him calmly. "Excuse me, Blake," I said, keeping my voice even. He did not even grant me the respect of calling me by my name. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the keys to his pristine silver Mercedes, and tossed them directly at my chest. I caught them on reflex. "Do me a favor and move my car out of the garage," he said, his voice dripping with absolute authority. "And while you are at it, move that piece of poverty stock you drove here in. Park it around the back near the trash cans where it belongs. I do not want it ruining the aesthetic of my driveway." My guests are asking if the gardener showed up late. A few of his colleagues chuckled, a low murmuring laugh that burned the air. I looked past Blake, searching for Jada. My beautiful daughter, the girl I had carried on my shoulders and worked 80-hour weeks to put through college. She was standing near the grand foyer holding a glass of champagne. She heard every single word. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Instead of walking over to defend me, instead of correcting her husband, she looked down at the floor and turned her back, pretending to be deeply interested in a conversation with a woman next to her. That turned head hurt more than any insult Blake could ever throw at me. My own flesh and blood chose a facade of fake wealth over the father who gave her everything. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the keys back in his face. In my years of building Hayes Holdings from a single storefront into a multi-million-dollar trust, I learned that anger is a complete waste of energy. Silence is much more lethal. I looked at Blake, gave him a warm, chilling smile, and simply nodded. "Of course, sir," I said softly. "I will take care of it right now." I turned around, the vintage clock still tucked under my arm, and walked to his Mercedes. I got in, backed it out smoothly, and parked it perfectly where he wanted. Then I got into my Ford. I did not park it by the trash cans. I drove it straight out of the gated community and headed back to the city. I left his housewarming party before I ever stepped foot inside. As I drove down the highway, the silence in the cabin of my truck felt incredibly heavy. I pulled over into a quiet parking lot and picked up my phone. I dialed a number I knew by heart. Michael, my corporate lawyer, answered on the second ring. "Good evening, Terrence. What can I do for you on a Saturday night, Michael?" I said, staring out at the city lights. "I need you to quietly pull a full financial background check on Blake Kensington. Look into his real estate firm, his personal accounts, his mortgages, absolutely everything. I want to know exactly how he is funding his life and who he owes money to." "Consider it done," Michael replied instantly. He knew my tone. He knew something major had shifted. I went home to my quiet, comfortable townhouse, set Camille's clock on the mantel, and poured myself a glass of bourbon. I slept soundly, knowing the wheels were in motion. The next morning, the sunlight was streaming through my kitchen windows as I drank my coffee. My phone vibrated on the granite counter. It was Jada. I stared at the screen for a long moment. A part of me, the foolish, hopeful father part, thought she was calling to apologize. I thought she might say she was sorry for how Blake acted, sorry that she froze and ignored me. I swiped to answer. "Good morning, Jada," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Dad?" she started. Her voice was brisk, clipped, completely devoid of any guilt or warmth. "Listen, I am calling because we need a huge favor. Blake is putting together a massive commercial real estate deal, and he is a little short on the capital requirements for the bank." I remained perfectly silent, waiting for the punchline. "We need you to bring over the deed to Mom's ancestral land in Savannah," she continued, as if asking to borrow a cup of sugar. "Blake says the equity on those 50 acres is perfect to use as collateral. We need you to sign it over for a mortgage. Just temporarily, of course. He will pay it back when the deal closes. Bring the papers to our house this afternoon." The sheer audacity of her demand echoed in the kitchen. Less than 12 hours ago, her husband had humiliated me in front of dozens of people, treating me like dirt on his shoes. She had turned a blind eye, and now she was casually asking me to hand over the only piece of land my late wife had left our family so her arrogant husband could leverage it for a business loan. I realized then that they truly believed I was a naive, helpless old man who existed only to serve their financial needs. They thought I was just the driver. They had no idea they were trying to run over a mountain. I let Jada finish her ridiculous pitch, then I gave her a single word. "No." I hung up the phone before she could even formulate a response or throw a tantrum. I did not owe her an explanation, and I certainly did not owe her arrogant husband my late wife's property. I poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee and went back to reading the morning Financial Times. Exactly 30 minutes later, a heavy, aggressive knock echoed through my hallway. I glanced at the security monitor. It was Blake. He was standing on my porch holding a bottle of wine that looked like it came from the bargain bin at the local gas station. His tailored designer suit from the night before was replaced by a casual polo shirt, but the air of supreme entitlement hung around him like a toxic cloud. I unlocked the door and let him in. He plastered on a wide, fake smile that completely failed to reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Terrence," he said, holding up the cheap bottle as if it were a peace offering. "I came to apologize for last night. It was a highly stressful evening, and I let my mouth get ahead of me. We are family, right? I want to make things right between us." He stepped into my home without waiting for an invitation, treating my space with the same disregard he treated me. I gestured for him to sit at the small kitchen table. He placed the wine down and leaned forward, intertwining his fingers. His tone shifted instantly into the polished pitch of a desperate corporate salesman. "Listen, Terrence." He began, using my first name as if we were peers. "Jada and I are trying to build a lasting legacy. We are trying to secure a future that benefits all of us. You sitting on that empty land in Savannah does not help anyone. If you let me leverage it, I can guarantee you a massive return on investment." I poured him a glass of water, keeping my expression entirely blank. "What kind of legitimate deal requires you to use your father-in-law's ancestral land, Blake?" I asked softly. He waved his hand dismissively as if the details were beneath him. "It is just a temporary bridge loan. My firm is on the verge of closing a massive merger. We are just waiting on a capital injection from a major corporate player. Have you ever heard of Hayes Holdings?" I kept my face completely still. The name of my own investment fund rolling off his tongue was almost too comical to believe. "No," I said mildly. "Tell me about them." Blake puffed out his chest, looking important. "They are a ghost fund. Absolute titans in the commercial real estate sector. The chairman is notoriously private, but he controls billions in assets. We have a proposal on his desk right now. Once he signs off, my firm gets a massive bailout and my personal commission will be in the 7 figures. I just need your land to cover my margins until the Hayes money clears. He was so caught up in his own grand illusion that he did not even realize he had just admitted his firm was failing. He was banking his entire existence on a bailout from my company. He was begging for my land to survive until my company gave him money. "So you are betting my wife's legacy on a ghost?" I asked. Blake sighed heavily, looking at me like I was a toddler who did not understand basic arithmetic. "Terrence, this is high-level finance. You drove a truck your whole life, so I do not expect you to grasp the complex corporate mechanics. Just trust me. Sign the deed over and I will take care of the rest." He pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his leather briefcase and slid them across the table along with an expensive silver pen. I looked at the dense legal jargon filling the pages. Instead of arguing, I decided to play the exact role he had already assigned me. The clueless, senile old man. I picked up the pen with a deliberately shaky hand. "My vision is not what it used to be, Blake," I muttered, bringing the paper inches from my face and squinting hard. "Where do I sign again?" "Right there at the bottom," he said, tapping the dotted line impatiently. "Just your full legal name." I slowly dragged the pen across the paper, writing the name of my favorite childhood dog Buster instead of my own. While I made a grand show of struggling to flip to the next page, I slipped my free hand into my pocket. I blindly typed a quick message to Michael using the physical buttons on my phone. Dig deeper. Check illegal debts. Blake snatched the first page to inspect it and let out a sharp, frustrated breath when he saw the nonsense scribble. "Terrence, this is invalid." He snapped, his fake friendly demeanor cracking at the seams. "You wrote Buster. Are you losing your mind? I need your actual signature for the bank." "Oh, my mistake," I said, widening my eyes in feigned confusion. "Let me get my reading glasses from the other room. My memory slips sometimes." I stood up, shuffling my feet slightly, and walked into the hallway, leaving him alone with his rising panic. I needed to buy time for Michael to uncover the truth. As soon as I was out of sight, my phone buzzed silently in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the incoming message from Michael. It was far worse than I had originally anticipated. The text read, "He is not just leveraged with traditional banks. He owes $500,000 to an underground lending syndicate. They are actively threatening him. Your Savannah land is the exact collateral he promised them to buy more time." I stared at the glowing screen. Blake was not trying to build a family legacy. He was trying to save his own kneecaps from dangerous loan sharks by feeding them my wife's ancestral land. I put the phone away and walked back into the kitchen, dropping the frail old man act. I did not grab my glasses. Instead, I reached for the heavy glass pitcher of water resting on the table. As I lifted it, my hand slipped purposefully. The pitcher tipped over, sending a flood of ice-cold water directly onto his pristine legal documents. The ink immediately began to bleed and wash away, ruining the contracts completely. Blake shot up from his chair, cursing loudly as the water soaked the sleeves of his expensive shirt. "What is wrong with you?" he yelled, slamming his fist onto the wooden table. "Look what you did, you clumsy old fool!" I looked up at him. The polite mask was completely gone. His face was twisted in absolute rage and his eyes burned with a vicious, desperate cruelty. He was no longer the polished corporate executive. He was a cornered, terrified animal. "If you ruin this for me," he hissed, leaning in close enough for me to smell the stale wine on his breath, "I will make sure Jada puts you in a nursing home so fast your head will spin. Now print new copies and sign the damn papers." I did not print new copies. I simply opened my front door and waited silently for him to leave. Blake stormed out, muttering violent curses under his breath. He promised he would be back, and he kept his word. 2 days later, my doorbell rang again. I checked the security monitor in my hallway. Blake stood on my porch, but this time he was not alone. Beside him stood a tall man in a crisp white medical coat holding a sleek leather briefcase. I knew exactly what this was. Blake had realized he could not intimidate me into signing away my wife's land, so he was going to strip me of my legal right to refuse. I unlocked the door. Blake pushed his way inside, stepping heavily onto my rug and gesturing for his companion to follow. "Terrence." "This is Dr. Evans, Blake," said his voice dripping with fake saccharine concern. "Jada and I have been very worried about your recent behavior. The memory lapses, the confusion, the unprovoked aggression with the water pitcher. We decided it was best to bring a professional to evaluate you in the comfort of your own home." The man calling himself Dr. Evans offered a tight, clinical smile. He did not look around the room. He did not carry the tired, empathetic aura of a real physician. He looked exactly like a hired actor playing a role. Good morning, Mr. Hayes, the man said smoothly. We are just going to do a simple routine assessment. Please have a seat at the table. I did exactly as they asked. I shuffled over to the dining table and sat down heavily, playing the part of a fragile senior citizen. What Blake did not know was that 30 minutes before they arrived, Michael had warned me about Blake searching for shady medical professionals on the payroll of local loan sharks. Knowing Blake's predictable desperation, I had already taped a high-definition digital voice recorder directly underneath the oak surface of my dining table. It was currently capturing every single syllable spoken in the room. Dr. Evans sat across from me while Blake stood in the corner watching like a hawk. The doctor pulled out a generic-looking notepad and clicked his pen. "Mr. Hayes, can you tell me what day it is?" he asked slowly as if speaking to a toddler. I let my jaw drop slightly, staring blankly at the wall behind him. "I think it is Tuesday," I whispered. It was actually Friday. The doctor scribbled something down. Blake smirked from the shadows, clearly enjoying the show. "And can you tell me the name of your daughter?" The doctor continued, his tone entirely devoid of genuine medical inquiry. I furrowed my brow, letting my hands tremble visibly on the tabletop. "My daughter," I repeated, my voice cracking perfectly. "My sweet girl. Her name is..." I paused, staring helplessly at my hands. "Her name is Sarah. No, wait. It is Camille. Just like my wife." Blake stepped forward, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "See, doctor," he said, shaking his head. "He does not even know Jada's name anymore. This has been happening for weeks. He ruined important legal documents the other day because he forgot how to spell his own name. He is a complete danger to himself." The doctor nodded solemnly, not even bothering to ask follow-up questions or conduct a proper neurological exam. "This is a textbook presentation of rapid-onset dementia," he stated definitively, right there at my dining table. "His cognitive decline is severe. I would say he is suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease. He completely lacks the capacity to make rational decisions regarding his health care or his finances." I kept my head bowed, letting my shoulders slump in mock defeat. Inside, my blood was boiling, but my mind remained icy sharp. My own son-in-law had hired a fraud to declare me legally incompetent just to steal my property. It was a vile, despicable tactic used to rob the elderly of their autonomy and dignity. But I was not a defenseless old man. Every lie, every fake medical term, every piece of manufactured evidence was being recorded crystal clear. Dr. Evans reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of official-looking medical forms. He did not hesitate for a single second. He filled out the diagnosis section with rapid practice strokes of his pen checking boxes that declared me legally incapacitated. "I strongly advise that the family assumes immediate power of attorney," he said, signing the bottom of the page with a flourish. "He requires round-the-clock supervision and a designated financial guardian to prevent him from squandering his remaining assets." Blake practically leaped across the room. He snatched the paper from the table before the ink was even dry. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated greed. "Thank you, Dr. Blake," said his voice vibrating with triumph. "We will take it from here. I will file this with the courts and the banks immediately to protect his estate." Blake carefully folded the fraudulent certificate and slid it into his expensive briefcase, patting it as if it were a winning lottery ticket. He looked down at me, his expression morphing from fake sympathy into raw, unfiltered arrogance. "Do not worry, Terrence," he sneered quietly so the doctor would not hear. "I will take excellent care of your land. Maybe I will even find a nice, affordable care facility for you, one with a small window if the budget allows." They walked out of my house, leaving me sitting alone at the table. The moment the front door clicked shut, I stopped trembling. I sat up straight, reached under the table, peeled off the voice recorder, and hit save. The trap was set. Blake did not waste a single second. Driven by the mounting pressure of his illegal debts and the dangerous people he owed money to, he drove straight to my local bank branch less than an hour before they closed for the weekend. He walked into the lobby with his shoulders thrown back, radiating the false authority of a man who believed he had just conquered his greatest obstacle. He bypassed the line and marched directly to the desk of the branch manager. He slapped the forged medical certificate onto the wood, demanding immediate and total control over my accounts. "I want a complete freeze on all of Terrence Hayes' assets," he commanded, loudly drawing the attention of the tellers. "I am initiating emergency guardianship due to his severe mental decline. Give me the current balances and the transfer authorization forms right now." The manager, a woman I had known and trusted for 15 years, reviewed the document with a perfectly neutral expression. She typed my name into her system, clicked her mouse a few times, and looked back up at Blake. "I can certainly freeze this specific checking account, sir," she said calmly. "However, I must inform you that the available balance is only $2,000. Blake froze in his tracks. His arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by sheer confusion. "2,000, he demanded, slamming his hand on the desk. "That is impossible. He has an entire retirement fund. He has liquid capital. Where is the rest of his money?" The manager adjusted her glasses and looked directly into his panicking eyes. "All other liquid assets and property deeds linked to Mr. Hayes were permanently transferred out of this institution," she stated flatly. "They were moved into a private blind trust at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon. The account you are trying to freeze is virtually empty." Blake stared at her, his face draining of all color as the crushing reality of his failure hit him like a freight train. Blake drove back to his $3 million mansion in a blind panic. The moment the heavy oak doors closed behind him, his carefully constructed facade shattered completely. He stormed into his home office and swept his arm across his mahogany desk, sending crystal tumblers, expensive fountain pens, and framed photographs crashing to the hardwood floor. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the empty hallway, but he did not care. Jada was out at a social event, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging directly above her husband's neck. Blake gripped his hair, breathing heavily. The fake medical certificate was entirely useless now. The banks could not touch a blind trust. The legal route would take months of tied-up litigation, and he did not have months. He did not even have weeks. His burner phone vibrated aggressively in his pocket. It was a text message from the underground lending syndicate. "Time is up, Blake. We want our $500,000 by Monday, or we start breaking things you actually care about." The threat was not a metaphor. These were men who made people disappear. Desperation gnawed at his sanity. He needed the Savannah property to appease them, but as long as I was breathing and legally protected by a trust, he could not touch a single acre. The realization settled over him like a dark, heavy cloud. He could no longer rely on forged documents or slick corporate maneuvers. He needed me out of the picture permanently. The clock struck 2 in the morning when a dark, sleek sedan rolled silently to a stop a block away from my townhouse. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as Blake stepped out dressed entirely in black. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face and tight leather gloves. He moved with the frantic, paranoid energy of a man who was crossing a line he could never uncross. He crept up my driveway, sticking to the shadows until he reached my 1998 Ford F-150. He had always mocked this truck, calling it a rusted eyesore, but tonight he viewed it as his ultimate salvation. He believed that an old truck driven by an old man would naturally succumb to mechanical failure. A tragic accident that no one would ever question. What Blake did not know was that while the exterior of my truck looked like it belonged in a scrapyard, the internal security system was state-of-the-art. Just last month, I had a specialized mechanic install a military-grade 4K resolution stealth dashcam system. The lenses were hidden within the grille, and the rear-view mirror equipped with motion sensors and infrared night vision. As soon as Blake stepped within 3 feet of the bumper, the cameras silently woke up, recording his every move in perfect high definition. I was fast asleep inside my home, completely unaware that my son-in-law was currently sliding underneath the undercarriage of my vehicle. The camera captured his face clearly as he pulled a heavy pair of steel wire cutters from his jacket pocket. Sweat glistened on his forehead, illuminating his sheer desperation. He reached up toward the brake lines. He did not cut them completely through. He was far too calculating for that. He snipped just enough of the thick rubber casing to ensure a slow, steady leak. He wanted the brakes to fail gradually right when I was traveling at high speeds on the highway. He wanted it to look exactly like a tragic maintenance failure. The camera recorded the distinct snap of the wire cutters, the heavy breathing escaping his lips, and the malicious smirk that crossed his face as he slid back out from under the truck. He stood up, dusted off his dark jeans, and vanished into the night, leaving behind a rigged death trap. He thought he had just solved all of his problems. He thought he was walking away, a rich man. The next morning, the Georgia sun was shining brightly as I walked out to my driveway with a mug of black coffee in my hand. I was planning to drive to the local market, but as I approached the driver's side door, I noticed a dark, slick puddle pooling near the front left tire. I kneeled down and rubbed the viscous liquid between my fingers. It was brake fluid. My instincts, honed by decades of dealing with ruthless competitors, kicked in immediately. I did not panic, and I certainly did not start the engine. I pulled out my smartphone and opened the encrypted application linked to my truck's security system. I scrolled through the motion-triggered events from the previous night. My blood ran completely cold as I watched the crystal-clear infrared footage of Blake severing my brake lines. He had escalated from financial fraud to attempted murder. I did not call the police right away. A simple police report would tip him off and ruin the larger trap I was setting. Instead, I called a trusted, certified master mechanic who frequently serviced the armored vehicles for my corporate executives. I told him to bring his mobile rig to my house. When he arrived, he thoroughly inspected the undercarriage and confirmed exactly what I already knew. The line was intentionally sabotaged, he said, handing me a signed official diagnostic report outlining the deliberate tampering. I paid him generously for his discretion and had my truck towed to a secure garage. I returned to my home office and downloaded the undeniable 4K footage onto an encrypted hard drive. I now held the key to his absolute destruction. Miles away, in his luxurious Buckhead mansion, Blake was standing on his sprawling master balcony. He was dressed in a plush silk robe, sipping an expensive espresso and staring out at the manicured lawns of his neighborhood. He kept checking his phone every few minutes, eagerly waiting for the inevitable call from Jada or the local authorities informing him of my tragic fatal car crash. He was already rehearsing his fake tears and drafting his condolences. He felt untouchable, but the phone call he was desperately waiting for never came. Instead, his corporate smartphone vibrated aggressively on the glass patio table. He picked it up, expecting an update from his junior partners. It was an urgent, high-priority email directly from the chief executive officer of his real estate firm. The subject line read, "Final Notice." Blake opened the message, and his smug, triumphant smile evaporated instantly. The email was a brutal, uncompromising 48-hour ultimatum. "We have discovered severe discrepancies in your recent financial reports," the email read. "Massive amounts of company funds are unaccounted for. You have exactly 48 hours to secure the capital injection from the chairman of Hayes Holdings. If you fail to close this deal by Tuesday morning, you will be terminated immediately with cause, and we will hand over the embezzlement evidence directly to the authorities." Blake dropped his espresso cup. The fine porcelain shattered against the balcony tiles, spilling dark coffee everywhere. His pulse hammered in his ears. He was expecting to inherit my wealth today. Instead, he was now facing total financial ruin and a guaranteed prison sentence if he did not convince the mysterious billionaire chairman of Hayes Holdings to save his life. He had no idea that the very man he needed to beg for salvation was the exact same man he had just tried to murder. While Blake was spiraling into a corporate panic, my private investigator delivered another devastating blow. A thick manila envelope arrived at my townhouse via a secure courier. I opened it at my kitchen table, expecting to see more details about Blake's illegal loan sharks. Instead, I found a meticulously documented portfolio of his absolute betrayal of my daughter. The first few pages contained high-resolution photographs of Blake walking hand-in-hand with a young blonde woman. The investigator identified her as Monica, a high-end commercial real estate broker. She was not just a casual mistress. She was the exact broker Blake had secretly hired to appraise my ancestral land in Savannah behind my back. They were mixing their illicit affair with a calculated plot to steal and liquidate my late wife's property. The photos showed them dining at exclusive restaurants, laughing over expensive champagne, and entering luxury hotel rooms in the middle of the afternoon. While Jada was busy playing the role of the perfect supportive corporate wife defending her husband at every turn, Blake was spending his days plotting my financial ruin with the very woman he was sleeping with. He was a parasite feeding off my family's legacy to fund his arrogant delusions. But the investigator's report went much deeper than just infidelity. It exposed exactly how Blake was paying for this extravagant double life. The second half of the file contained a stack of intercepted financial statements. Blake had maxed out his own credit cards months ago, so he had moved on to draining Jada's accounts. I stared at a recent credit card statement bearing my daughter's name. There was a glaring transaction for $12,000 at a Cartier boutique downtown. The investigator attached a crystal-clear security photograph from the boutique. It showed Blake standing at the glass display counter purchasing a diamond pendant necklace. The next photograph in the file showed Monica wearing that exact same diamond pendant at a rooftop bar while kissing my son-in-law. He was using my daughter's personal credit line to buy diamonds for the woman helping him steal my land. The sheer audacity of his actions made my blood run entirely cold. He was not just a bad businessman, he was a complete sociopath. I gathered the credit card statements, the photographs of the Cartier purchase, and the extensive evidence of his severe financial mismanagement. I did not call Jada. Showing her these photos now would only make her confront him, giving him a chance to spin a web of manipulative lies and somehow make himself the victim. He needed to be stripped of his power first. Instead, I compiled a comprehensive dossier detailing his fraudulent activities. I included his unauthorized use of credit lines, his massive undocumented debts, and his reckless mixing of personal affairs with corporate real estate appraisals. I placed the dossier into a thick, unmarked envelope. I drove to a post office on the other side of the city and paid in cash to have the package sent via priority overnight delivery. The recipient was not my daughter. The recipient was the chief compliance officer at Blake's commercial real estate firm. I sent it as an anonymous whistleblower tip regarding severe internal financial fraud and severe breaches of corporate ethics. The package was flagged for urgent review upon delivery. I knew the corporate policies of his firm very well because they were one of the smaller agencies that frequently bid for my company's scraps. Their compliance department was notoriously ruthless when it came to unauthorized debt and fraud. They could not afford a scandal. By sending that dossier, I was ensuring that Blake's pristine professional reputation would be entirely obliterated. He had built his entire identity around being a wealthy, successful executive. Without that fake armor, he was nothing but a desperate liar. Blake thought his only problem was the impending deadline to secure the Hayes Holdings capital. He had no idea I had just lit a match and tossed it directly into the powder keg of his career. I went back home and waited for the inevitable explosion. The fallout was faster and more brutal than even I had anticipated. The next morning, Blake was sitting in a high-stakes strategy meeting with the senior partners of his firm. He was desperately trying to buy time, sweating through his expensive suit, as he promised them the Hayes Holdings deal was practically guaranteed. Right in the middle of his frantic presentation, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. The chief compliance officer walked in, accompanied by two large uniformed corporate security guards. The entire room fell dead silent. The compliance officer did not mince words. He looked directly at Blake and informed him that a severe internal investigation had just been launched regarding massive financial irregularities and blatant ethical violations. Blake tried to laugh it off, attempting to use his usual arrogant charm to dismiss the interruption. He told the partners it was clearly a misunderstanding or a smear campaign by a jealous rival. The compliance officer did not smile. He ordered Blake to surrender his company phone, his laptop, and his keycard immediately. Right in front of the colleagues he had spent years trying to impress, Blake was physically escorted out of the boardroom by security. They marched him through the open plan office past all the junior brokers and assistants who watched in stunned silence. He was officially suspended pending a full legal review of his finances. He was thrown out onto the street, his career effectively terminated in a matter of minutes. The humiliation was absolute. The man who had arrogantly tossed his car keys at my chest, ordering me to move my truck, was now standing on the sidewalk clutching a cardboard box of his personal belongings. He had lost his primary source of income and his corporate shield. Stripped of his job and completely out of time, Blake descended into absolute panic. He drove his pristine Mercedes back to his Buckhead mansion, driving recklessly like a man fleeing a burning building. The 48-hour ultimatum from his CEO was now entirely irrelevant. His most immediate threat was the underground lending syndicate. They did not care about his corporate suspension. They only cared about their $500,000, and they were demanding a massive payment by the end of the day. Blake rushed into his home office and locked the door behind him. His own accounts were frozen or empty. His credit cards were maxed out. In his frantic, desperate state, he crossed the final unforgivable line. He booted up Jada's personal desktop computer. He knew her passwords, having watched her log in countless times. He accessed her secure private banking portal, bypassing the security protocols. He navigated directly to the education trust fund they had set up for my grandson. It was a secure account holding $100,000 meant exclusively for the boy's future college tuition. Blake did not hesitate. Sweating profusely and breathing in ragged gasps, he initiated a direct wire transfer. He drained every single penny of his own son's college fund. He wired the entire $100,000 to an untraceable offshore account controlled by the loan sharks, hoping it would be enough to buy him a few more days of breathing room. He wiped out his child's future to save his own skin, leaving Jada completely oblivious to the massive theft happening right under her own roof. He closed the laptop and wiped his fingerprints off the keyboard, convincing himself he would somehow replace the money before anyone noticed. He was a sinking ship, pulling his entire family down into the dark, freezing depths with him. But his desperate theft was not a secret. My financial team was already monitoring the accounts, and the moment that massive wire transfer cleared my phone lit up with the alert. The stage was finally set for the ultimate confrontation. The temporary relief Blake felt after wiring his own son's college fund to the criminal syndicate lasted less than an hour. The loan sharks were temporarily pacified, but his life was still completely collapsing. He had no job, no corporate backing, and no future if he did not finalize the massive capital injection from Hayes Holdings. Desperation drove him to do the unthinkable. He waited in the underground parking garage of his former firm, hiding in the shadows, until his chief executive officer walked toward his luxury sedan. Blake ambushed him, blocking the car door. He threw away whatever remaining pride he had and begged. He pleaded with the CEO, claiming the compliance issues were a massive misunderstanding that he could resolve in a matter of days. But more importantly, he played his final desperate card. He told the CEO that he possessed a confirmed exclusive face-to-face meeting with the anonymous chairman of Hayes Holdings the very next morning. Blake promised that he would walk out of that boardroom with a signed multi-million-dollar contract that would save the entire firm. The CEO, a man driven entirely by corporate greed, hesitated. The promise of the Hayes capital was too massive to ignore. Looking at Blake with absolute disgust, the CEO granted him a 24-hour stay of execution. He told Blake that if he secured the signature by noon tomorrow, he would keep his job and the fraud investigation would quietly disappear. If he failed, the police would be waiting for him in the lobby. Armed with this final microscopic sliver of hope, Blake felt a renewed surge of arrogant, manic energy. He was convinced he was the smartest man in the world, capable of talking his way out of any consequence. But he still wanted his backup plan. He still wanted the ultimate control over my assets, just in case the negotiations required more collateral. That evening, my front door violently shook under the force of heavy, aggressive pounding. I opened it to find Blake and my daughter Jada standing on my porch. Blake pushed his way inside without a word, radiating a chaotic, unhinged energy. His eyes were bloodshot and his breathing was shallow and rapid. He paced my living room like a trapped predator while Jada stood quietly near the entryway, clutching her expensive designer handbag. Blake turned to me, completely dropping the fake polite son-in-law act. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. Tomorrow morning I am going to walk into the corporate headquarters of Hayes Holdings, and I am going to walk out a millionaire, he shouted, his voice echoing off my walls. I am closing the biggest deal of my life, and I am done playing these pathetic little games with you, Terrence. I want the deed to the Savannah property, and I want it tonight. I stood calmly in the center of the room, watching his meltdown. I did not raise my voice. You are not getting my wife's land, Blake, I said firmly. His face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. He closed the distance between us, invading my personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate me. If you do not hand over those property rights right now, I will use that medical certificate we got from Dr. Evans, he hissed, venom flying from his lips. I will drag you out of this house in front of all your neighbors. I will have you declared entirely incompetent, and I will lock you inside the filthiest, most underfunded mental asylum in this state. You will rot in a tiny room with a barred window, and I will take your land anyway. Do not test me, old man. I will destroy your life. I did not flinch at his threats. I slowly turned my gaze away from his manic face and looked directly at Jada, my own flesh and blood, the little girl I had sacrificed my entire youth to protect. She was standing right there, listening to her husband graphically threaten to lock her healthy father inside a psychiatric ward just to steal his property. I waited for her to step forward. I waited for her to scream at him, to tell him he had gone too far to defend the man who gave her life. But she did nothing. Jada looked down at the hardwood floor, shifting her weight uncomfortably, and completely avoided my eyes. She crossed her arms and remained entirely silent. Her silence was a physical blow. It was the absolute confirmation that my daughter was entirely lost to me, blinded by the illusion of wealth and willing to let me be destroyed to maintain her lifestyle. I took a deep breath, letting the painful reality settle into my bones. The heartbreak washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, impenetrable resolve. I looked back at Blake. He was smirking, thinking my silence was a sign of submission. He thought his cruel threats had finally broken my spirit. He thought the old driver was finally surrendering to his superior intellect. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I understand perfectly, Blake, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady whisper. you have made your intentions absolutely clear. You have a very big day tomorrow, a life-changing meeting. I will not stand in your way tonight. I truly wish you the best of luck tomorrow morning. You are going to need every single ounce of it." Blake let out a loud, arrogant laugh, believing he had won the psychological war. "You have until noon tomorrow to have those papers signed and ready," he demanded, adjusting the collar of his shirt. "Do not make me come back here and do this the hard way." He grabbed Jada by the arm and pulled her toward the door. She let herself be led away, never once looking back at me as she stepped out into the night. I locked the heavy deadbolt behind them. I did not feel fear or sorrow anymore. I only felt the terrifying calm before a massive storm. The next morning, the sun rose over Atlanta, casting a bright golden light across the city skyline. I woke up long before dawn. I walked into my bathroom and carefully, meticulously shaved my face. I washed away the facade of the frail, tired old man who drove a rusted truck. I walked into the back of my walk-in closet and pulled down a heavy protective garment bag that I had not opened in years. Inside was a custom-tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit cut perfectly to my exact measurements. I slipped on the crisp white dress shirt, fastened the expensive buttons, and slid into the suit jacket. I adjusted my dark silk tie and fastened a pair of heavy platinum cufflinks to my wrists. I opened a velvet box on my dresser and put on a vintage Patek Philippe watch. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The stoic, silent father was completely gone. The ruthless billionaire chairman of Hayes Holdings was staring back, ready to execute absolute corporate justice. Outside my modest townhouse, the quiet morning peace was broken by the smooth, silent purr of a massive engine. A pristine black Rolls-Royce Maybach with heavily tinted windows glided to a halt right at the edge of my curb. A personal driver dressed in a flawless dark suit stepped out of the vehicle and walked up my concrete pathway. He stood at attention, waiting respectfully. I picked up my leather portfolio, opened my front door, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The driver gave a deep, deferential bow and pulled open the heavy rear door of the luxury vehicle. "It is time, Mr. Chairman," the driver said, his voice echoing quietly in the morning air. I nodded, giving my quiet neighborhood one last glance before sliding into the plush, leather seating of the Maybach. The door shut with a solid, reassuring thud. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, heading straight toward the financial district. Blake was walking into the most important meeting of his life, expecting to con a faceless billionaire. He had absolutely no idea that the executioner waiting for him in that boardroom was the very man he had threatened to lock in an asylum just 12 hours ago. Blake stepped out of the high-speed elevator and onto the 50th floor of Hayes Tower. The entire level was a testament to immense corporate wealth, designed with imported Italian marble floor-to-ceiling glass walls and sleek minimalist architecture. He smoothed the lapels of his light gray designer suit, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable confidence. He approached the pristine reception desk where a young professional woman was typing quietly. "I am Blake Kensington," he announced loudly, expecting her to immediately recognize his name and drop everything she was doing. "I have an exclusive meeting with the chairman. Tell him I have arrived." The receptionist barely looked up from her screen. "Please have a seat." "Mr. Kensington," she said in a polite but firm tone, "the chairman will be ready for you in boardroom A shortly." Blake scoffed, rolling his eyes at what he perceived as her complete incompetence. "You do not tell me to wait, sweetheart," he sneered, adjusting his silk tie. "Just open the doors. I am about to save your entire company a massive headache." The receptionist remained entirely unbothered. "Boardroom A is down the hall to your right," she replied, gesturing vaguely. Blake marched down the corridor, feeling like a conquering emperor returning from battle. He entered the massive glass-walled boardroom and set his slim leather briefcase on the sprawling mahogany table. He began laying out his glossy presentation folders, arranging his charts and financial projections with absolute precision. He stared out the vast windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline below him. He felt an intense rush of power. In his mind, he had already won the war. He had survived the compliance investigation, he had temporarily appeased the violent loan sharks, and now he was about to secure a multi-million-dollar deal that would cement his legacy forever. He took a deep breath, ready to deliver the pitch of his life. 10 minutes later, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Blake immediately plastered on his most charming, high-wattage corporate smile, ready to greet the billionaire savior of his career. But the smile froze instantly on his face. The man walking through the doors was not a faceless corporate entity. It was me. I walked into the room with slow, deliberate steps, my custom Tom Ford suit draping perfectly over my shoulders. I carried a simple leather portfolio in my hand. Blake stared at me, his jaw dropping slightly as his brain struggled to process the sheer impossibility of the image before him. For a fraction of a second, deep confusion clouded his eyes, but his deeply ingrained arrogance quickly overrode his common sense. He completely ignored the expensive cut of my suit and the heavy platinum watch on my wrist. To him, I was still just the pathetic old man he had threatened in a living room 12 hours ago. "What the hell are you doing here?" he shouted, his voice cracking with sudden furious panic. "Driver who let you into this building. This is a highly restricted corporate floor. Get out right now before I call security and have you thrown out on the street." I did not stop walking. I did not blink, and I certainly did not raise my voice to match his frantic yelling. I maintained absolute total silence. My footsteps echoed softly against the hardwood floor as I bypassed his side of the long table. "Are you deaf, old man?" Blake demanded, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. He took a step toward me, pointing aggressively toward the exit. "I told you I have the most important meeting of my life right now. You are going to ruin everything. Get out of this room immediately before I have you arrested for trespassing." I ignored him completely. I walked straight to the head of the massive mahogany table, the seat reserved exclusively for the absolute highest authority in the room. I reached out, pulled the heavy leather chairman chair back, and sat down. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood and looked directly up at him. The sheer authority in my posture finally made him pause. The furious words died in his throat as he stared at me sitting at the head of the table. A cold, creeping realization began to claw at the edges of his mind, but he was still too deeply entrenched in his own delusions to accept the reality unfolding right in front of him. Before Blake could muster another insult, the boardroom doors opened a second time. My lead corporate attorney, Michael Thorne, stepped into the room. Michael was a man renowned throughout the entire Atlanta financial district for his absolute ruthlessness in high-stakes corporate litigation. He wore a sharp, dark suit and carried a thick, heavy file under his arm. He did not even glance at Blake initially. He walked directly to my side and slammed the heavy file down onto the mahogany table with a loud, resounding crack that made Blake physically flinch. Michael stood tall, buttoned his suit jacket, and finally turned his cold, piercing gaze toward my son-in-law. "Good morning," he said, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "Let us dispense with the useless pleasantries so we can get straight to the actual business today." He gestured formally toward where I was sitting at the head of the table. "I would like to officially introduce you to Mr. Terrence Hayes. He is the founder, the majority shareholder, and the absolute sole chairman of Hayes Holdings. He will be directly evaluating your desperate request for a capital injection today." Michael paused intentionally, letting the monumental weight of those words hang in the silent air of the boardroom. The silence was so thick, it felt completely suffocating. "Now, if you are quite ready, Mr. Kensington." Michael continued, gesturing to the scattered charts and glossy folders on the table with a look of pure disdain. "You may begin your presentation. We have a very tight schedule today, so I suggest you start explaining your financial metrics immediately. We expect a flawless pitch. The chairman is waiting to hear your best offer." All the blood instantly drained from Blake's face, leaving him an ashen, ghostly white. The arrogant swagger, the polished corporate bravado, the desperate confidence, it all vanished in a single, devastating heartbeat. His knees visibly buckled beneath him. He stumbled backward, and his hands scrambled blindly for the edge of the mahogany table to stop himself from collapsing completely onto the floor. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally connecting the name of my massive investment company with the last name of the woman he had married. The rusty old truck, the quiet demeanor, the modest townhouse, it had all been a test. A test he had failed in the most spectacular and criminal way possible. I reached into the heavy file Michael had provided. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. It was the fraudulent medical document Dr. Evans had signed in my dining room declaring me completely mentally incompetent. I slid it forcefully across the smooth wooden table until it stopped right inches from his trembling hands. "You brought this garbage to my house to steal my wife's land," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "You tried to declare me insane to take my property and lock me away." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, locking my eyes onto his horrified, sweating face. "But here is the massive problem with your brilliant legal strategy, Blake," I continued, enjoying the absolute terror radiating from his body. "A man suffering from severe cognitive decline cannot possibly authorize and sign a $50 million capital injection contract, right, son-in-law? Your entire future relies on a signature you just tried to legally invalidate." Blake stood completely frozen, his mind entirely incapable of processing the monumental collapse of his reality. He looked from the forged medical document resting on the polished table up to my cold, unyielding face, and then back down again. The pristine air-conditioned boardroom suddenly felt like a blazing furnace. Heavy beads of sweat broke out across his forehead, rolling down his temples and soaking into the crisp collar of his expensive designer shirt. The fabric of his light gray suit grew noticeably dark with perspiration beneath his arms. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. His vocal cords seemed paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his terror. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was a pathetic, trembling squeak, completely devoid of the arrogant, booming tone he used just minutes prior to insult my receptionist. "Terrence," he stammered, taking a shaky, hesitant step backward. "Sir, please. This is a massive misunderstanding. You have to believe me. Eve. That document, it was just a precautionary measure. Jada and we were just worried about your health. We never intended to use it against you. I swear on my life." He raised his shaking hands, palms outward in a desperate gesture of surrender. The confident corporate shark was gone, completely replaced by a cornered coward desperately trying to lie his way out of a trap that had already snapped shut around his neck. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs, the panic wrapping around his throat like a vice. I did not even grant his pathetic lies the dignity of a verbal response. Instead, I reached across the table and picked up the glossy, impeccably bound business proposal he had spent weeks preparing. The proposal that was supposed to save his failing firm and make him a millionaire. I held it up, looking him dead in the eye, and then I slowly, deliberately ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of the thick paper tearing echoed sharply in the silent boardroom. I tossed the shredded halves onto the floor like meaningless trash. Blake let out a strangled gasp, his eyes wide with absolute horror as he watched his entire future flutter to the ground. But I was not finished. I nodded to Michael. Michael opened his sleek laptop, typed a few rapid keystrokes, and connected the boardroom's massive wall monitor to a highly secure live video feed. The large screen flared to life, revealing the stern, impatient face of Blake's chief executive officer. The CEO looked confused at first, but when he saw Michael Thorne standing next to me, the chairman of Hayes Holdings, the color instantly drained from his face. "Good morning," Michael said, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "I am representing Chairman Hayes. We are calling to formally decline your firm's request for a capital injection." The CEO swallowed hard, glancing at Blake, who was visibly trembling in the background. "May I ask why?" the CEO asked, nervously terrified of losing the monumental deal. "Because," Michael stated flatly, "your director of mergers and acquisitions sitting right here in our office is a massive legal liability. He is currently carrying $500,000 in illegal debt to a violent lending syndicate. Furthermore, he has been actively forging medical documents to steal property from his own family just to cover those debts. We have the absolute proof right here on the table." The CEO stared at the screen, his expression shifting rapidly from professional shock to absolute unadulterated fury. Blake tried to step into the camera frame, waving his hands frantically to salvage the situation. "Sir, it is a lie," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I can explain everything. Please do not listen to them. I have the numbers ready." The CEO silenced him with a vicious, booming shout that echoed through the monitor. "Shut your mouth, Blake. You are a complete disgrace to this agency. You lied to the senior partners you embezzled from our clients, and you brought your filthy criminal mess to the doorstep of the biggest investor in the city. You are officially terminated, effective immediately. We are stripping your broker licenses right now and handing everything over to the federal authorities. You will never work in real estate anywhere in this country again." The video call abruptly cut off, leaving a black, silent screen. Blake's career, reputation, and future were entirely annihilated in less than 3 minutes. The reality of his complete and utter destruction finally broke him. Blake's legs gave out entirely. He collapsed onto the polished glass floor of the boardroom, landing hard on his knees. The expensive suit pants tore slightly at the seams, but he did not care. He crawled across the cold floor like a desperate, pathetic insect, closing the distance between us. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the heavy sweat dripping from his chin. He reached out and grabbed the fabric of my custom trousers, his knuckles turning white as he clung to me for dear life. "Terrence, please," he sobbed, his voice breaking into a loud, hysterical wail. "I am so sorry. I messed up. I messed up so badly. Please do not do this to me. The loan sharks, they will kill me. They will literally end my life if I do not pay them by tomorrow morning. You have to help me." He pressed his wet face against my leg, begging without a single ounce of shame or dignity remaining. "Think of Jada," he cried out, using his ultimate shield, the only weapon he thought he had left. "Think of your own daughter. She loves me, Terrence. We are building a life together. If I go down, I will drag her down into total bankruptcy with me. You cannot let the mother of your future grandchildren lose her home and end up on the street. Please just give me a loan. I will pay you back every single cent, I promise. I will do whatever you want, just do not let them destroy me." I looked down at the weeping, broken man clinging to my legs. He was actually trying to use my love for my daughter as a bargaining chip to save himself from the brutal consequences of his own criminal greed. It was the most repulsive, cowardly act I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I kicked my leg back sharply, breaking his frantic grip on my trousers. Blake sprawled backward onto the glass floor, clutching his empty hands to his chest and staring up at me with wet, terrified eyes. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. I looked at Michael and gave a curt, decisive nod. Michael pressed a button on the intercom embedded in the mahogany table. "Security, we need a removal in boardroom A immediately," he instructed calmly. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy doors swung open and two massive uniformed security guards marched into the room. They grabbed Blake by his armpits, hoisting him violently off the floor. He kicked and thrashed, screaming my name and crying out for mercy as they dragged him backward toward the exit. "Wait!" I commanded, raising my hand. The guards paused, holding Blake suspended in the air. His eyes widened with a desperate, fleeting spark of hope, thinking I had suddenly changed my mind and decided to save him. I reached into my suit pocket and pulled out a heavy metallic object. It was the rusted keyring belonging to my 1998 Ford F-150. The very same vehicle he had mocked in front of his elite guests. The very same vehicle he had crawled under in the dead of night to sabotage. I tossed the keys through the air. They hit him squarely in the chest and clattered onto the floor beneath his dangling feet. "Take it, driver," I said, my voice cold and lethal. "You can use it to get home today. But drive very carefully, Blake. It would be a terrible tragedy if the brakes suddenly failed on the highway." The spark of hope in his eyes instantly died, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The blood drained from his face as he realized I knew absolutely everything. I knew about the nighttime sabotage. I knew about his attempted murder. As the security guards dragged him out into the hallway, his terror morphed into something much darker. The last thing I saw before the heavy boardroom doors clicked shut was his face twisting into an expression of frantic, psychotic hatred. Blake drove my old truck back to Buckhead. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. By the time he walked through the grand double doors of his mansion, he had already concocted a masterful web of lies to save his own skin. He found Jada pacing in the living room and immediately collapsed onto the designer sofa, burying his face in his hands. He forced out fake, loud sobs, playing the ultimate victim of a cruel billionaire. He spun a wild, deeply manipulative story, claiming that I was not just a retired driver, but a secret, vindictive corporate titan who harbored a deep-seated hatred for him. He told Jada that I was so unbelievably petty over the parking incident that I used my immense corporate power to bribe his chief executive officer. He convinced her that I had him fired entirely out of spite, effectively destroying their family income and ruining his flawless professional reputation forever. Jada listened to his fabricated tale of woe, and her initial shock quickly boiled over into absolute blistering rage. She did not stop to question his ridiculous story. She did not ask for evidence or consider my long history of quiet support. She saw her husband weeping and immediately decided that her own father was the villain. She grabbed her car keys, stormed out of the mansion, and drove recklessly toward my townhouse. her mind clouded with furious indignation and a desperate need to defend her husband. I had just returned home and changed out of my Tom Ford suit when the aggressive pounding started on my front door. It was so loud and frantic it rattled the glass window panes. I opened the door to find my daughter standing on my porch. Her face was flushed with anger, her eyes narrowed into hostile slits. Before I could even greet her, she reached into her expensive designer purse, pulled out the spare key to my townhouse, and hurled it directly at my face. It struck my collarbone and clattered onto the hardwood floor. "How could you do this?" she screamed, her voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. "You completely ruined my husband. You destroyed our entire family over a stupid parking comment." I stood perfectly still, letting her unleash her misguided fury. I did not interrupt her tirade. I did not try to defend myself. I knew that arguing with someone blinded by emotional manipulation was a complete waste of breath. Blake told me everything. She continued, stepping closer and pointing an accusatory finger right at my chest. "He told me you used your hidden money to bribe his boss and get him fired. He is a good man trying to provide for us, and you tore his career apart just to satisfy your own massive ego. You are supposed to be my father. You are supposed to protect us and support our future. Instead, you act like a petty, vengeful tyrant trying to control my life. I am done with you. Do you hear me? I am entirely done. I am disowning you. You are no longer a part of my life or my son's life. Do not ever contact us again." Her words were sharp, designed to cut as deeply as possible. She expected me to break down. She expected me to beg for her forgiveness or try to desperately explain my side of the story. She wanted a dramatic screaming match to validate her anger. Instead, she was met with absolute suffocating silence. I looked at her with a calm, steady, unyielding gaze. I saw the little girl I had raised, but I also saw a grown woman who was fiercely defending a literal monster. I did not offer a single word of explanation. I did not tell her about the forged medical documents, the illegal loan sharks, or the severed brake lines on my truck. She was not ready to hear the truth from my lips. She needed to experience it. She needed to see it with her own two eyes. I reached into my slacks and pulled out a sleek black envelope. It was the package Michael had prepared for me earlier that morning, containing the final piece of the puzzle. I held it out toward her, keeping my arm perfectly steady. Jada stared at it suspiciously, refusing to take it at first. "Take it," I commanded, my voice carrying a heavy, undeniable authority that made her instantly flinch. She slowly reached out and snatched the envelope from my hand, gripping it tightly. She ripped it open with shaking fingers. Inside the envelope was a single plastic electronic key card and a small, crisp white card with an address printed in bold black ink. It was the address of a highly exclusive luxury high-rise condominium complex in the center of downtown Atlanta. "What is this?" she demanded, glaring at the keycard and then back at me. "Is this some kind of sick joke or another one of your manipulative games?" I looked her dead in the eye, my expression completely unreadable and entirely devoid of emotion. "That is an address," I stated flatly. "I want you to go to that exact location at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon. Use that keycard to open the door." I paused, letting the weight of my instructions settle heavily over her shoulders. "If you go to that apartment and you still want to disown me after walking through that door, I will accept your decision without a fight. I will never call you again. I will walk out of your life entirely, and you will never have to see my face for as long as you live. But you must go there at 3 o'clock. I stepped back and closed my front door, shutting it firmly in her face before she could utter another angry word. Jada sat in her car outside my house for a long time, staring blankly at the black key card resting in her palm. Her fierce anger was slowly being replaced by a creeping, gnawing sense of profound doubt. Despite her furious words, she knew deep down that I was not a petty or vindictive man. The absolute icy certainty in my voice haunted her. At 2:45, she pulled into the underground parking garage of the downtown luxury high-rise. She rode the private elevator to the penthouse level, her heart hammering aggressively against her ribs. When the digital clock on her phone struck exactly 3 o'clock, she stood in front of the heavy oak door matching the number on the card. She raised her trembling hand, pressed the electronic key card against the scanner, and heard a soft green beep. She pushed the door open, stepping onto the plush white carpet. The apartment was completely silent except for the low murmur of voices coming from the master bedroom down the hall. Jada walked quietly, holding her breath. She turned the corner and froze completely. The scene playing out in front of her was like a physical, brutal blow to the stomach. Blake was standing next to a massive open suitcase spread across a king-sized bed. He was frantically stuffing thick banded stacks of $100 bills into the luggage. It was the exact amount of cash stolen directly from her son's education trust fund. But that was not the worst part. Standing right next to him, wrapping her arms possessively around his neck, was Monica. The blonde real estate broker was pressing her lips passionately against Blake's mouth while his hands, greedy and desperate, gripped her waist. Jada stood paralyzed in the doorway, watching her entire reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. Jada stood absolutely petrified in the doorway of the penthouse bedroom. Her mind struggled to process the grotesque scene unfolding right in front of her eyes. Her husband, the man she had viciously defended just hours ago, the man she had screamed at her own father for, was passionately kissing another woman while packing away the stolen future of her own son. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit her like a physical blow, but it did not bring tears. There was no weeping, no hysterical sobbing, and no desperate pleading. Instead, a cold, dark wave of absolute fury washed over her, completely erasing any remaining trace of the naive, devoted wife she had been. She felt a burning, white-hot rage ignite deep within her chest, spreading through her veins like liquid fire. Her eyes darted around the luxurious room and locked onto a heavy crystal vase resting on a sleek glass console table near the entrance. Without making a single sound, she marched over and wrapped her fingers around the thick-cut crystal. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She lifted the heavy vase high above her shoulder, took a deliberate step forward, and hurled it with every ounce of strength she possessed directly at Blake's head. The crystal missile soared across the bedroom and smashed violently into the wall, mere inches from his skull, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The deafening crash echoed through the penthouse, causing Blake and Monica to jump apart in absolute terror. Blake spun around, his eyes wide with initial shock as shards of crystal rained down onto the plush carpet. When he saw Jada standing in the doorway, his momentary fear instantly evaporated. He did not look ashamed. He did not drop to his knees and beg for her forgiveness. Instead, a slow, cruel smirk spread across his face, completely obliterating the charming facade he had worn for their entire marriage. He looked at her not with the guilt of a caught cheating husband, but with the ultimate disdain of a predator who no longer needed to hide behind a mask. "What is the matter, Jada?" he sneered, his voice dripping with venomous arrogance. "Are you upset that I am finally taking what is rightfully mine?" Monica stepped behind him, clutching her blouse, looking mildly annoyed rather than remorseful. Jada stared at him, her voice trembling with raw anger. "You stole our son's education fund," she demanded, stepping further into the room, her fists clenched at her sides. "You are draining his future to run away with this cheap broker." Blake let out a loud, mocking laugh that chilled Jada to the bone. "Oh, please," he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively at her outrage. "Do not act like you and your pathetic family actually earned any of this. I spent years pretending to tolerate you. I spent years smiling at your arrogant, stubborn father and playing the progressive, modern husband for your social circle. You have absolutely no idea how exhausting it was to sit at your dinner table and pretend I did not despise everything about where you came from." He stepped closer, his words becoming increasingly vicious and laced with horrific racial vitriol. "You really thought a man of my caliber would marry into a family like yours for actual love?" He mocked, his tone dripping with deep-seated racial prejudice and supreme entitlement. "You and your father are nothing but a pair of uncultured fools sitting on prime real estate." I looked at that ancestral land in Savannah and saw a gold mine being wasted by people who lacked the genetic pedigree to understand its actual worth. You were just a convenient stepping stone, Jada. A naive, desperate woman who wanted a white picket fence and a country club membership so badly she would happily ignore every single red flag I waved in her face. I tolerated your heritage and your embarrassing father strictly for the equity. I married you for the deed to that land, and since your father decided to ruin my career this morning, I am taking this cash as my rightful severance package. Now get out of my way before I have you thrown out of this building." The sheer cruelty of his words, the vile, racist hatred he had kept hidden behind a polished smile, finally snapped the last remaining thread of Jada's restraint. The illusion of her perfect marriage shattered as completely as the vase on the floor. She let out a guttural scream of pure anguish and lunged at him, She closed the distance between them in a split second, swinging her fists with wild, desperate energy. She struck him hard across the jaw, her rings cutting a sharp line into his cheek. Blake stumbled backward, cursing loudly in surprise, but his physical advantage quickly overpowered her furious assault. He grabbed her aggressively by the shoulders, his fingers digging painfully into her skin, and shoved her backward with brutal, violent force. Jada lost her footing, her heels tangling in the thick carpet, and crashed heavily onto the floor, her elbows striking the sharp edge of a heavy wooden nightstand. She gasped in pain, clutching her arm as Blake loomed over her, adjusting his wrinkled shirt with a look of pure contempt. "I told you to get out," he spat, looking down at her with absolute disgust. "Grab the bags, Monica. We are leaving right now." He reached for the massive suitcase packed tight with the stolen cash. Before his fingers could even touch the leather handle, the heavy oak door of the penthouse was kicked open with a deafening explosive crash. Wood splintered and flew across the living room as heavily armed tactical police officers swarmed into the hallway. Atlanta Police Department, a booming voice commanded over the chaos. "Get your hands in the air right now. Do not move a single muscle." The officers flooded into the bedroom clad in dark tactical gear and aiming their weapons directly at Blake and his mistress, blocking any possible route of escape. Blake froze entirely, his hands shooting straight up into the air as the color drained from his face for the second time that day. He had completely underestimated the sheer speed and absolute ruthless efficiency of Michael Thorne. My corporate lawyer had not wasted a single moment after the massive wire transfer was detected. He had immediately contacted the federal authorities and the local police department, handing over irrefutable digital evidence of Blake embezzling a minors' protected trust fund and attempting to flee the jurisdiction with the stolen capital. The officers shoved Blake roughly against the bedroom wall, forcefully pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed perfectly in the chaotic room. He was instantly stripped of his freedom, his stolen money, and his arrogant pride. Monica screamed hysterically as an officer handcuffed her as well, charging her as an active accomplice to the grand theft. Jada remained sitting on the floor, surrounded by the glittering shards of the shattered crystal vase. She watched the man she thought she knew, the man she had chosen over her own father, being dragged out of the penthouse, kicking and screaming pathetic excuses about misunderstandings. The sheer adrenaline left her body, leaving behind a crushing, overwhelming wave of realization. Her perfect life was a complete and utter fabrication. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, and dialed my number. I answered on the very first ring, sitting quietly in my home office. "Dad," she sobbed, her voice cracking completely as the hot, bitter tears finally began to stream down her face. "Dad, you were right. I am so sorry. I lost everything." I listened to her completely break down through the receiver. I did not gloat. I did not yell. I did not say "I told you so." I kept my voice perfectly calm, steady, and commanding, offering the solid foundation she had just realized she desperately needed. "When you are done crying, Jada," I said simply, "pack your things and come home." Blake was sitting in a maximum security county jail cell, stripped of his tailored suits and his fake corporate arrogance. Denied bail due to his blatant attempt to flee the jurisdiction with stolen funds, he was finally experiencing the very real consequences of his actions. But a criminal syndicate does not simply write off $500,000 just because the debtor is sitting behind iron bars. They do not care about the justice system. They only care about their money, and they are completely merciless in how they collect it. With Blake locked away, they immediately shifted their violent focus to the next available target, Jada. She had returned to the sprawling Buckhead mansion alone, attempting to pack her belongings, completely unaware that her husband's dangerous mess was waiting for her in the shadows. The very next night, she was abruptly jolted awake by the deafening sound of shattering glass. Massive bricks were hurled through the expensive floor-to-ceiling living room windows, sending jagged shards flying across the imported rugs. When she ran out to the driveway in a state of absolute panic, she found the grand double doors of the mansion completely vandalized. Thick, bright red paint was splashed across the pristine white columns, and the entryway looking exactly like fresh blood dripping down the steps. Pinned to the front door with a heavy hunting knife was a crude, terrifying handwritten note. It did not ask politely for an extension. It demanded an immediate payment of $50,000 by Friday, or her young son would be the next target. The luxurious fairy tale life she thought she had was officially a living, breathing nightmare. Terrified for her physical safety and her son's life, Jada frantically tore through Blake's locked filing cabinets in his home office. She needed to know exactly how deep this financial hole went. She smashed the brass locks with a heavy paperweight and pulled out thick stacks of hidden financial documents he had kept secret for years. What she found made her physically sick to her stomach. There were 3 separate high-interest loan contracts from the underground syndicate detailing exorbitant interest rates and brutal penalty clauses. But Blake had not just ruined his own financial standing. As Jada flipped to the signature pages, her heart stopped entirely. At the bottom of every single page, right next to his signature, was her own name, written in dark blue ink. Blake had meticulously forged Jada's signature on every single illicit loan contract, legally binding her to the criminal syndicate. She was officially on the hook for $500,000 of extremely dangerous debt. The man she loved, the man she had defended against her own father, had used her as a human shield against violent criminals, completely broken and out of options. Jada grabbed her son, drove straight to my townhouse, and pounded frantically on my front door. When I opened it, she collapsed completely. She did not just cry. She dropped straight down to her knees onto the hardwood floor of my foyer, weeping with a raw, agonizing desperation I had never heard from her before. "Dad, please," she begged, grabbing my hands with trembling fingers. "They are going to kill me. They are going to take your grandson." Blake forged my name on 3 different loans from the syndicate. I owe them $500,000, and they want the cash right now. "Please, Dad, I know you have it." You own the company. You have millions. Just write them a check and make this go away. I will do anything. I will work for you for the rest of my life. Just, please, save us from this." She looked up at me with terrified, swollen eyes, expecting the loving father she had known her entire life to instantly swoop in and write a blank check to erase her problems. She expected the magical billionaire bailout. But the man standing over her was no longer the soft, enabling father she had completely taken for granted. I looked down at my weeping daughter, feeling a deep, profound ache in my chest. Every paternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to transfer the funds and protect my family from harm. But I knew that handing her $500,000 in cash would teach her absolutely nothing. It would only reinforce the toxic illusion she had lived by for years, that money magically appears to fix every reckless mistake. I gently pulled my hands away from her desperate grip and took a deliberate step back. "No," I said, my voice firm and entirely unyielding. "I am not giving you a single dollar to pay off those thugs." Jada froze, her tears stalling as pure shock washed over her face. "Dad, what are you saying?" she whispered, looking at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "I am saying that I will handle the physical safety of my grandson through my own private security channels," I explained coldly. "I will make sure no one touches him. But I will not pay a dime of that debt for you. You allowed a monster into your home. You turned a blind eye to his blatant financial abuse and his arrogant cruelty. Because you liked the luxury cars, the big mansion, and the status. You looked the other way when he humiliated me because you wanted to belong to his fake world. Now you have to face the absolute reality of your choices. You are moving out of that ridiculous mansion today. You will sleep in your old childhood bedroom down the hall. You will sell every single designer item you own to cover your basic living expenses. And tomorrow, you are going out to find a night shift job waiting tables or scrubbing floors to pay the minimum interest on those loans yourself. You have to relearn the absolute value of a single hard-earned dollar, Jada. You will not rebuild your life with my wallet. You will rebuild it with your own 2 hands. Jada stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. She searched my face for any sign of weakness or capitulation, but she saw no hesitation in my eyes. She swallowed her immense pride, slowly stood up from the floor, and simply nodded. Over the next 48 hours, she completely dismantled her fake aristocratic life. She hauled dozens of authentic Hermes bags, Rolex watches, and custom designer dresses to high-end pawn shops and consignment stores, taking pennies on the dollar just to scrape together enough cash to feed her son. She swallowed her immense humiliation and applied for a late-night waitress position at a local 24-hour diner. Late that Sunday night, she was sitting on the floor of her old childhood bedroom, exhausted from her first grueling shift carrying heavy trays. She was unpacking the last few cardboard boxes she had hastily thrown together from Blake's home office. She reached into a box of old tax returns and pulled out a thick sealed envelope with my name typed across the front. Curious, she broke the seal and slid the heavy parchment papers out. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy taken out in my name. She scanned the document, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. Blake was listed as the primary executor of the estate, but as she flipped to the final page, her blood turned completely to ice. Attached to the standard policy was a highly specific, recently added premium rider. It guaranteed a massive $1 million immediate payout in the exact event of accidental death caused by a traffic collision. Jada stared at the horrific document, her hands shaking violently. The memory of Blake tinkering in the garage late at night flashed through her mind. The realization hit her with the force of a speeding train. Blake had not just been stealing my money. He had meticulously calculated the exact financial value of my violent death on the highway. Jada sat frozen on her childhood bedroom floor. The heavy parchment paper of the life insurance policy slipped from her trembling fingers. The horrific pieces of a puzzle she never wanted to solve were suddenly snapping together with terrifying clarity. The late nights Blake spent pacing in the garage, the sudden questions he had asked about my driving habits and the exact route I took to the grocery store, the condescending jokes about my rusted 1998 Ford F-150 lacking modern safety features. He had not just been insulting me to boost his fragile ego. He had been assessing the vulnerability of his target. He had carefully calculated the exact financial value of my violent death on the highway and insured it for a cool $1 million. Her stomach churned violently as the pure evil of his intentions washed over her. She snatched the documents from the floor, scrambled to her feet, and sprinted down the hallway. She did not bother knocking. She burst into my home office where I was quietly reviewing financial reports. "Dad," she gasped, struggling to pull air into her panicked lungs. She slammed the insurance policy down onto my mahogany desk. Her face was ashen and her entire body shook as if she were standing in freezing rain. "He did not just want your land, Dad. He took out an accidental death policy. He wanted you dead in a car crash. He was going to kill you." I did not gasp. I did not act surprised. I simply looked down at the insurance document resting on my desk and nodded slowly. "I knew Jada," I said, my voice completely steady. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small encrypted USB drive. I stood up, gesturing for her to follow me into the living room. I walked over to the massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall and plugged the drive into the side port. "Sit down, Jada," I commanded softly, pointing to the sofa. "You need to see exactly who you married." I picked up the remote and selected the security file from the drive. The large screen flickered to life, displaying the crisp, high-definition infrared footage captured by the hidden cameras in the grille of my truck. Jada sat on the edge of the cushions, her hands gripping her knees. She watched as a dark, sleek sedan pulled up to our street in the dead of night. She watched as a man dressed entirely in black crept up my driveway. When the man pulled back his hood, the ultra-clear 4K resolution left absolutely zero room for doubt. It was Blake. Jada let out a sharp, strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. The camera recorded him pulling heavy steel wire cutters from his jacket. It captured the exact malicious smirk on his face as he slid underneath the undercarriage of my truck. The audio picked up the distinct metallic snap as he deliberately severed my brake lines, ensuring a slow, catastrophic leak meant to kill me at high speeds. The sheer, calculated psychopathy of his actions played out in vivid detail right in front of her eyes. The man she had shared a bed with, the man she had fiercely defended against my supposed cruelty, was a cold-blooded attempted murderer. The realization hit her physical body like a violent shockwave. She could no longer contain the absolute revulsion building inside her. Jada scrambled up from the sofa, rushed to the adjoining half-bathroom, and violently threw up into the sink. She emptied her stomach, retching and sobbing simultaneously, completely disgusted by the monster she had called a husband. She had protected a man who was actively plotting to slaughter her own father for a payout. I walked over and gently placed a hand on her shaking back, waiting for her to finish. When she finally rinsed her mouth and looked up at me, her eyes were completely different. The last shred of the naive socialite was gone. What was left was a fierce, hardened woman seeking absolute retribution. We did not waste another minute. I grabbed the fraudulent life insurance documents, the extensive financial dossiers, and the encrypted hard drive containing the undeniable video evidence. Jada walked with me to the car, her posture rigid and her face set in cold, unforgiving stone. We drove directly to the Atlanta Police Department headquarters. We bypassed the standard civilian desk and went straight to the lead investigator handling Blake's ongoing embezzlement and fraud case. We laid every single piece of evidence out on the metal interrogation table. The detective, a seasoned veteran who thought he had seen the worst of human greed, watched the 4K footage of Blake cutting the brake lines in complete, stunned silence. He reviewed the $1 million accidental death insurance policy, aligning the purchase dates perfectly with the night of the vehicular sabotage. The financial motive, the premeditated planning, and the physical execution were all undeniably verified and meticulously documented. The detective closed the file and looked at us with grim, absolute determination. "This changes the entire scope of our investigation," he stated firmly. "We originally had him dead to rights on grand larceny, identity theft, and corporate fraud. But this is no longer just a white-collar crime case. I am contacting the district attorney right now. We are officially upgrading his charges to first-degree attempted murder. He is looking at spending the rest of his natural life behind iron bars." Jada did not flinch when she heard the extreme severity of the charges. She simply nodded, finally accepting that the man she married needed to be locked away from society permanently. But the absolute destruction of Blake Kensington was not going to be quite as simple as locking him in a cell and throwing away the key. Blake had not come from nowhere. He was the product of generations of inherited wealth and entrenched privilege. His parents, Richard and Victoria Kensington, were old-money Atlanta socialites who operated with the arrogant belief that the law simply did not apply to people in their tax bracket. The moment they received the frantic phone call from their son detailing his upgraded murder charges, they mobilized their vast resources. They did not care that he was guilty. They only cared about protecting their pristine family name. Less than 24 hours after the attempted murder charges were officially filed, the Kensingtons dispatched the most expensive and ruthless criminal defense attorney in the state to the county jail. Bypassing standard procedures, their legal team exploited obscure judicial loopholes and posted an exorbitant emergency bail package to secure Blake's temporary release pending trial. The news hit us like a sudden physical blow, but they did not stop at merely bailing him out. The Kensingtons officially entered the war room. They sent a highly intimidating formal letter to my corporate headquarters officially declaring their intent to completely crush me and my company. They swore they would use every ounce of their immense wealth and deep political connections to destroy Terrence Hayes and ensure their precious golden child never saw the inside of a prison cell. They thought they could intimidate me with their old money tactics. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared war on a man who owned the very ground they walked on. I decided to dictate the terms of our very first face-to-face meeting. I did not invite Richard and Victoria Kensington to my pristine corporate boardroom at Hayes Holdings. I chose a rundown, dimly lit diner on the far outskirts of the city. It was a place with sticky vinyl booths, flickering neon signs, and the heavy smell of fried grease lingering in the air. I sat in a corner booth wearing my old faded work jacket, nursing a simple cup of black coffee. Precisely at noon, the heavy diner door swung open. Richard and Victoria walked in looking utterly repulsed by their surroundings. Richard wore a bespoke pinstripe suit tailored to perfection, and Victoria was draped in expensive cashmere, clutching a designer handbag tight against her chest, as if she feared the very air in the diner would contaminate it. They looked around with deep, undisguised disgust, wiping the vinyl bench with a silk handkerchief before reluctantly sitting across from me. They looked at my worn jacket and my old rusted truck parked outside the window. Their expressions shifted immediately from environmental disgust to pure, arrogant pity. They genuinely believed I was just a poor, desperate old man entirely out of my depth. They thought I was a helpless, uneducated pawn they could easily squash with a tiny fraction of their generational wealth. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting across from their absolute worst nightmare. Richard did not even bother to order a coffee or offer a basic, polite greeting. He reached inside his tailored jacket, pulled out a crisp gold-embossed checkbook and a heavy gold fountain pen. He quickly scribbled a number, ripped the check from the binding, and tossed it across the sticky table. It landed right next to my coffee mug. The amount was written for exactly $100,000. Victoria leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the table, her lips curled into a cold, condescending smile. "Let us cut right to the chase, Terrence," she said, her tone dripping with elite arrogance. "We know Blake made some foolish mistakes. He got involved with the wrong people and he handled his finances poorly. But this entire attempted murder narrative you and your daughter have fabricated is completely absurd. It is a desperate, ridiculous reach from a family clearly trying to cash in on our prominent surname." Richard tapped his fingers impatiently against the vinyl booth. "That check right there is more money than you have likely seen in your entire lifetime," he stated flatly. "Consider it a generous charitable donation to your retirement fund. You are going to take that cash, call the district attorney, and drop every single one of those ridiculous criminal charges against our son immediately. You will say the brakes on your old junk truck simply gave out due to poor maintenance and that the security video is tampered with. If you do not comply, things will get incredibly difficult for you and Jada. You do not want to go to war with us, Terrence. People like you do not have the resources, the pedigree, or the stamina to sue a family like ours. We have judges on our payroll. We will drag this out in civil court for decades until you are bankrupt and completely homeless. Take the charity money, go back to your quiet little life, and let the real adults handle the situation." They sat back, crossing their arms, perfectly confident that they had just bought my permanent silence. They thought their money was the ultimate weapon against a man like me. I did not touch the check. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a simple silver lighter. I flicked the metal wheel, producing a bright, steady flame. I calmly picked up their $100,000 bribe, held the corner of the crisp paper directly to the fire, and watched as the flame quickly consumed it. The bright orange fire illuminated the sudden absolute shock on their arrogant faces. I dropped the burning ashes into the aluminum ashtray on the table, letting the thick smoke drift up between us. Richard bolted upright, his face turning bright red with outrage. "Are you completely insane?" he shouted, drawing the attention of the few patrons in the diner. I did not answer him directly. Instead, I reached into my battered leather satchel resting on the seat next to me. I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents securely bound in thick red folders. I pushed the heavy stack across the table exactly where their burned check had just rested. "These are not medical records or police reports, Richard," I said, my voice low, cold, and entirely unyielding. "These are the corporate debt acquisition files for Kensington Enterprises. You see, while you were busy trying to buy my silence this morning, I was actively buying your entire existence. Your family company has been bleeding money for years, keeping up appearances while secretly drowning in bad commercial loans. At 8 o'clock this morning, my investment firm Hayes Holdings officially purchased the entirety of your defaulted corporate debt from your panicked lenders. I now personally own $15 million of your outstanding liabilities." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the sticky table, locking my eyes onto Richard's pale, terrified face. "I am officially your largest creditor." I stated my words, striking them like brutal physical blows. "Your massive generational wealth is a complete illusion. You are entirely leveraged on fake money, and I currently hold all the strings. Here is your ultimate reality check, Richard. You have exactly two choices today. Either your psychopathic son rots in a maximum security prison for the rest of his natural life, or tomorrow morning, I will call in every single one of those loans. I will forcefully foreclose on your corporate assets. I will seize your commercial properties, and I will personally put you and your wife out on the street with absolutely nothing. I will strip you of your country club memberships, your luxury cars, and your pristine fake reputation. You will lose absolutely everything you hold dear." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria raised her trembling hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. The arrogant elite posture vanished completely. They finally realized that the man sitting across from them was not a poor, helpless driver to be mocked. He was the apex predator of the Atlanta financial food chain, and he had them completely surrounded with no escape route. Richard's hands shook violently as he grabbed his cell phone from his suit pocket. He did not yell. He did not threaten me anymore. He frantically dialed his defense attorney, his voice cracking with pure, absolute terror. "Revoke the bail," he ordered the lawyer, his eyes locked onto mine in total submission. "Cancel the bond immediately. Send Blake back to the county jail right now. We are dropping our support." The day of the trial arrived with a heavy, oppressive atmosphere hanging over the grand downtown courthouse. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing my tailored charcoal suit, projecting an aura of quiet, unbreakable resolve. Jada sat next to me, her posture rigid, her face an unreadable mask of stone. When the heavy wooden doors at the side of the courtroom opened, the murmurs in the gallery instantly died down. Blake was escorted in by two armed bailiffs, and the sight of him was genuinely jarring. The pristine, tailored suits, the expensive haircuts, and the arrogant swagger of the high-powered corporate executive were entirely gone. He shuffled into the room wearing an oversized bright orange county jail jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clinked loudly with every pathetic step he took. His face was gaunt, his skin a sickly pale gray, and dark bruised circles hung heavily beneath his sunken eyes. He looked desperately around the crowded gallery, searching the faces of the spectators for any sign of salvation. He was looking for his parents, Richard and Victoria. He was expecting the cavalry of inherited wealth to ride in and rescue him. But the mahogany benches reserved for his family were completely empty. Not a single member of the Kensington family had shown up to support him. I had completely neutralized their financial power, and he was finally facing the absolute terrifying reality of total isolation. The trial commenced, and Blake's court-appointed defense attorney immediately launched into a desperate, pathetic narrative. Stripped of the high-priced legal team his parents had originally hired, Blake was left with a lawyer who clearly knew this was a losing battle. The attorney stood before the jury painting a ridiculous picture of a man driven to the absolute brink by crushing corporate expectations. He argued that Blake was suffering from an intense psychological breakdown caused by the high-stress environment of commercial real estate and the terrifying pressure of violent loan sharks. He claimed that the severed brake lines and the financial embezzlement were not the acts of a cold-blooded killer, but the frantic, misguided mistakes of a severely panicked husband trying to save his family from ruin. It was a complete insult to human intelligence. When the prosecution finally called me to the witness stand, I walked past Blake without giving him a single glance. I took the oath, placing my hand on the Bible, and sat down looking directly at the 12 men and women of the jury. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a calm, measured clarity that commanded absolute attention. I recounted the relentless financial abuse, the blatant disrespect, and the discovery of the sabotaged truck. But the absolute fatal blow came when the prosecutor asked me about the day Blake brought a medical professional into my home. I looked at the jury and explained how Blake had attempted to forcefully strip me of my legal autonomy by declaring me severely demented. The prosecutor then submitted Exhibit 42 into evidence. It was an audio recording Michael Thorne had secured just days prior. Michael had tracked down the fraudulent physician Dr. Evans and offered him a simple choice: testify to the truth or face federal fraud charges alongside Blake. The courtroom speakers crackled to life. Dr. Evans's nervous voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. The doctor explicitly confessed that Blake Kensington had paid him $10,000 in cash to sign a blank medical certificate. He admitted on the recording that he knew I was in perfect mental health, but Blake had demanded a diagnosis of advanced Alzheimer's disease, specifically to seize control of my Savannah land and my financial trusts. The audio played the doctor quoting Blake, saying that I was just an old fool who needed to be locked away so he could finally cash out. The reaction in the courtroom was instantaneous and physically palpable. I watched the faces of the jurors as the recording laid bare the absolute depths of Blake's calculated cruelty. Several jurors literally gasped, covering their mouths in sheer horror. Others shook their heads in profound disgust, glaring at Blake with a fierce, unmistakable contempt. They were no longer looking at a stressed executive who made a terrible mistake. They were looking at a vicious, remorseless predator who had meticulously plotted to destroy a healthy elderly man, lock him in a psychiatric ward, and steal his entire life's work. The defense attorney's psychological pressure narrative completely imploded in real time. You could see the physical defeat wash over the lawyer. He dropped his pen onto his legal pad and slumped back into his chair, entirely abandoning any further attempts to cross-examine me. He knew there was absolutely no coming back from premeditated medical fraud coupled with attempted murder. The evidence was an insurmountable mountain of guilt. Blake's hands trembled violently on the defense table as he realized that every single lie he had ever told was now exposed to the blinding light of public justice. The pristine image of the wealthy, successful businessman was entirely dead. He was exposed as a common, ruthless thief and a cowardly attempted murderer. The jury did not need to deliberate for long. The sheer weight of his malicious intent had sealed his fate long before the closing arguments even began. Pushed entirely into a corner with absolutely no remaining avenues of escape, the last fragile thread of Blake's sanity violently snapped. He could not accept that he had been completely outsmarted and utterly destroyed by the very man he had mocked in his driveway. As I stepped down from the witness stand, Blake suddenly leaped out of his chair, knocking it backward with a loud crash. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated, psychotic rage. The heavy steel chains around his ankles clanked aggressively as he lunged toward the wooden barricade separating us. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and unleashed a torrent of the most vile, despicable, racist hatred I had ever heard in my entire life. He screamed that I was nothing but a filthy street driver who had gotten lucky. He hurled horrific racial slurs that echoed through the stunned courtroom, blaming my heritage and my existence for his complete downfall. He shrieked that people like me did not deserve to hold power over people like him, exposing the deep-rotted supremacy he had hidden behind his tailored suits. Jada sat perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was watching the man she had loved, the man she had defended, unravel into a pathetic, hateful creature. Every vile word he screamed only confirmed that she had made the absolute right choice in leaving him. The pain of her broken marriage was entirely replaced by a cold, hard closure. The courtroom erupted in absolute chaos. Gasps of shock and shouts of outrage filled the gallery. Reporters scrambled to document the meltdown while everyday citizens shouted back at his disgusting display. The judge furiously slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sound block, the sharp cracks cutting through Blake's unhinged screaming. "Order in this court," the judge bellowed, his face flushed with extreme anger at the blatant display of bigotry. Bailiffs restrained the defendant immediately. Two large armed deputies tackled Blake, forcing him roughly back into his seat as he continued to spit venomous slurs in my direction. The judge glared down at him from the high bench, his expression completely merciless. "Mr. Kensington, you have just removed any microscopic shred of leniency this court might have ever considered extending to you," the judge declared, his voice a booming thunderclap of absolute finality. I stood calmly in the aisle, adjusting my suit jacket. Blake had just hammered the final nail into his own coffin. The silence in the courtroom following the judge's furious reprimand was absolute and heavy. The air felt thick with the undeniable weight of impending justice. The judge adjusted his thick dark robes and looked down at Blake with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. He did not see a misguided corporate executive. He saw a cowardly, vicious predator who had attempted to murder his own family for a financial payout. The judge picked up a stack of legal papers detailing the horrific scope of the crimes and cleared his throat. "Blake Kensington," the judge began, his voice booming across the grand mahogany walls. "You have demonstrated a complete and utter lack of basic human decency. You forged medical documents to steal from an elderly man, you embezzled from a protected trust fund, and you actively sabotaged a motor vehicle with the explicit intent to commit murder. Your actions are vile, calculated, and entirely unforgivable. Society must be completely protected from a man of your monstrous nature." The judge paused, letting his cold gaze pierce right through Blake's trembling frame. "It is the ruling of this court that you are guilty on all charges. For the crimes of grand larceny, elder abuse, medical fraud, and first-degree attempted murder, I hereby sentence you to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security state penitentiary. This sentence is to be served in its entirety with absolutely zero possibility of early release or parole." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sound block with a deafening final crack, sealing Blake's fate forever. The reality of losing 15 years of his life inside a concrete box finally shattered Blake completely. His legs gave out from underneath him, and he collapsed heavily against the defense table, weeping with loud, agonizing sobs. The arrogant racist monster who had just screamed slurs across the courtroom was instantly reduced to a pathetic, wailing child. He turned his tear-streaked face toward the gallery, his eyes darting frantically until they locked onto Jada. "Jada, please," he cried out, his voice cracking hysterically. "Do not leave me. You are my wife. You promised to stand by me. Please wait for me, Jada. I am so sorry. I love you." He reached his chained hands out toward her, begging for a microscopic shred of the loyalty he had so viciously abused. Jada did not cry. She did not flinch or look away. She stood up from the wooden bench, her posture straight and her face carved from cold, unforgiving stone. She walked slowly down the center aisle, ignoring the shocked murmurs of the reporters and the spectators. The armed bailiffs stepped aside instinctively, allowing her to approach the wooden barricade separating the gallery from the defense tables. Jada reached into her sleek leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, stapled packet of legal documents. They were the finalized absolute divorce decrees Michael Thorne had expedited through the family courts. She stopped right in front of Blake, looking down at his pathetic, weeping face with absolute revulsion. She picked up a heavy black ink pen resting on the defense attorney's desk. Without breaking eye contact with the man who had ruined her life, she flipped to the final page and signed her name with bold, sharp, aggressive strokes. She did not hand the papers to his lawyer. She lifted the thick, heavy packet and threw it directly into Blake's chest. The papers hit him hard, scattering across his bright orange jumpsuit and falling onto the courtroom floor. "We are entirely done," Jada stated, her voice a low, lethal whisper that echoed perfectly in the silent room. "Have a nice life in a cage." She turned her back on him completely and walked away. Blake shrieked her name, thrashing violently against his chains as the two armed deputies grabbed him by the shoulders and forcefully dragged his kicking, screaming body through the heavy side doors leading directly to the holding cells. Jada pushed through the heavy brass doors of the downtown courthouse and stepped out onto the wide concrete stairs. The bright, warm Atlanta sunlight hit her face, and for the first time in months, she took a massive, deep breath of fresh air. The toxic, suffocating weight of her marriage had finally been permanently removed from her shoulders. She felt a profound, immense sense of liberation washing over her entire body. The legal nightmare was officially over. Blake was locked away, the divorce was signed, and she was finally free to rebuild her life on a foundation of absolute truth and hard work. She walked down the steps toward her modest used sedan, feeling a quiet, swelling pride in the humble, honest life she was currently living. She drove directly to the local diner, where she had taken a job waiting tables, ready to start her evening shift with a genuine smile on her face. She spent the next 8 hours carrying heavy trays, serving food, and earning her own money $1 at a time. She felt safe. She felt protected by the finality of the justice system. But Jada was entirely unaware of the dark, terrifying reality lurking just beyond the jurisdiction of a courtroom judge. The criminal justice system had only handled Blake's legal crimes against his family. The judge's gavel did not erase the $500,000 owed to the ruthless underground lending syndicate. The criminal underworld did not care about court verdicts, divorce papers, or prison sentences. They only cared about balancing their ledgers, and they never walked away from a debt. It was past 2 in the morning when Jada finally finished her grueling diner shift. Her feet ached and she was utterly exhausted, but she felt a peaceful, quiet satisfaction. The streets of the city were completely empty and silent. She walked out the back door of the diner, navigating the dimly lit, narrow brick alleyway toward where she had parked her car. The darkness felt heavy, but she kept her head down, searching her purse for her keys. Suddenly, blinding high-beam headlights flooded the narrow corridor, entirely wiping out her vision. The roar of massive engines echoed off the brick walls. 3 large, black-armored SUVs screeched to a violent halt, boxing her in completely from the front and the rear. Jada froze her heart, stopping dead in her chest as the heavy vehicle doors swung open in unison. Several massive, imposing men stepped out into the harsh, glaring light surrounding her with terrifying military precision. From the lead vehicle, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a sharp, dark suit stepped forward. He did not look like a common street thug. He looked like corporate death. He walked right up to Jada, his face an emotionless mask of pure violence. He reached inside his tailored coat, pulled out a heavy black handgun, and pressed the cold steel barrel directly against the center of her forehead. Jada could not breathe. She could not scream. She stood completely paralyzed, staring into the eyes of a man who killed for a living. The man leaned in close, the smell of expensive cologne and gun oil filling her lungs. "Your husband goes to prison, but the wife's debt remains entirely unpaid," he stated in a low, terrifyingly calm voice. "You owe us $500,000. You have until tomorrow night to deliver the cash, or I will personally come to your house and take your son." The cold steel of the gun barrel pressed brutally hard against Jada's forehead, forcing her head back against the rough, damp brick wall of the alleyway. Her knees buckled completely beneath her, unable to support her own weight any longer. The sheer visceral terror of losing her young son stripped away every final ounce of pride and composure she possessed. She dropped heavily onto the filthy pavement, the sharp gravel tearing through her uniform pants and scraping her skin raw. She clasped her trembling hands together, looking up at the imposing syndicate boss through a thick, blinding veil of tears. "Please," she begged, her voice a ragged, hysterical whisper that echoed in the dark corridor. "Please do not hurt my little boy. He is completely innocent in all of this. I do not have that kind of money. My husband forged my signature on those loan contracts. He stole everything from our family and left us with absolutely nothing but this debt. I work the night shift in a diner. I am barely making minimum wage right now. I will pay you whatever I can every single week for the rest of my life, but you have to give me more time. You cannot take my son away from me." The mob boss did not blink. His eyes remained dead, hollow voids, completely devoid of any human empathy or compassion. He leaned down slightly, grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking her head back sharply. "We do not do long-term payment plans, sweetheart," he hissed, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and bitter coffee. "You have exactly 24 hours to find $500,000. Call your rich friends from your old neighborhood. Call your daddy. Or say goodbye to your kid forever." He cocked the heavy hammer of the handgun, the sharp metallic click ringing out like a definitive death sentence in the narrow, confined space. Before the syndicate boss could utter another violent threat, a deafening mechanical roar violently shook the brick alleyway. It sounded like an earthquake tearing directly through the narrow street. Suddenly, blinding high-intensity LED headlights flooded the opposite end of the corridor, completely wiping out the darkness and turning the night into blinding artificial day. The mob boss shielded his eyes, taking a step back as the massive roaring diesel engines grew exponentially louder. 6 enormous military-grade armored SUVs painted in tactical matte black surged into the alley, moving in a synchronized, highly aggressive formation. They screeched to a halt, perfectly boxing in the syndicate's vehicles and entirely blocking their only possible exit route. The heavy reinforced steel doors of the SUVs swung open simultaneously. Over 24 highly trained private security operatives flooded the alleyway, moving with terrifying lethal precision. They were dressed in full tactical combat gear, wearing heavy Kevlar vests, dark balaclavas, and tactical boots. They instantly surrounded the gangsters, forming an impenetrable, heavily armed perimeter. The sharp clatter of assault rifles being raised and cocked echoed aggressively off the brick walls. Dozens of glowing red laser sights cut through the dusty night air, landing directly on the chests, foreheads, and throats of the mob boss and his armed thugs. The street criminals froze entirely, their cheap handguns suddenly feeling completely useless against a literal private military unit. From the lead armored vehicle, the heavy rear door opened smoothly. I stepped out into the glaring headlights. I was not wearing my tailored corporate boardroom suits. I wore a heavy, dark wool trench coat, my posture completely straight and my expression radiating an absolutely lethal frozen calm. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center of the alley. The tactical operatives parted seamlessly to let me pass through their perimeter. Right beside me walked Michael Thorne, carrying a thick leather briefcase, his eyes scanning the trapped gangsters with absolute professional disdain. I did not look at the guns pointed in my direction. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the man who had dared to put a weapon to my daughter's head. I walked until I was standing less than 3 feet away from him, ignoring the deadly tension vibrating in the humid air. The mob boss slowly lowered his handgun, his arrogant demeanor entirely crushed by the overwhelming display of raw, unrestricted power. He realized instantly that he had brought a common street gang to a full-scale corporate war. Michael Thorne stepped forward, bridging the gap between me and the terrified syndicate leader. He unclasped his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick-bound legal document, and slapped it violently against the hood of the mob boss's vehicle. "We are not here to engage in a pathetic street shootout," Michael stated, his voice slicing through the heavy silence like a sharpened razor blade. "We are here to execute a hostile corporate takeover." Michael pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at the legal document resting on the metal hood. "That is the complete ownership portfolio of Apex Logistics. It is the primary corporate shell company you and your criminal associates use to launder millions of dollars of illicit street money through the commercial real estate market in Atlanta." I took a deliberate step closer, forcing the mob boss to look directly into my eyes. The man was visibly sweating profusely, his prior confidence completely evaporated. "I just bought a controlling 90% stake in your entire money laundering operation," I said, my voice low, cold, and rumbling with absolute, unquestionable authority. "I own your corporate ledgers. I own your real estate fronts. I own the exact bank accounts you use to clean your dirty cash. I effectively own your entire criminal existence." I leaned in so close I could see the sheer panic dilating his pupils under the harsh headlights. "Here are your new terms of operation," I whispered lethally. "The debt forged by Blake Kensington is officially and permanently erased. It no longer exists. If you or any of your pathetic street soldiers even breathe in the general direction of my daughter or my grandson ever again, I will not just send my security team after you. Tomorrow morning, your entire client list, your offshore routing numbers, your exact physical locations, and every single piece of financial evidence connecting you to organized crime will land directly on the desk of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I will dismantle your entire syndicate before you even wake up, and you will spend the rest of your life in a federal supermax facility. Do we have a crystal clear understanding?" The mob boss swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He looked at the glowing red laser dots painting his chest, and then back at the comprehensive legal documents resting on his hood. He knew with absolute terrifying certainty that I was not bluffing. A man who could deploy a private military unit and legally buy a criminal shell company in less than 24 hours was a man who could erase him from the face of the earth with a single phone call. The gangster slowly holstered his weapon, holding his hands up in a gesture of total, complete surrender. He nodded frantically, sweat dripping steadily from his chin onto his shirt. "We understand," he stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "The debt is clear. We are gone. You will never see us again." He signaled frantically to his terrified men. They scrambled wildly back into their vehicles, throwing their cars into reverse and peeling out of the alley with reckless, desperate speed, eager to escape the deadly trap they had unwittingly walked into. The heavy, suffocating silence returned to the alleyway, broken only by the low, steady rumble of the armored SUVs. The security operatives lowered their rifles, maintaining a strict defensive perimeter around us. I turned away from the fleeing cars and looked down at Jada. She was still kneeling on the filthy pavement, sobbing uncontrollably, her entire body shaking violently from the massive adrenaline crash. The cold, lethal corporate titan vanished instantly, replaced entirely by a father who had almost lost his only child. I dropped to my knees on the rough gravel, ignoring the dirt ruining my heavy coat, and wrapped my arms tightly around my daughter. I pulled her fiercely close to my chest, shielding her from the harsh, brutal world she had just collided with. She buried her face into my shoulder, crying hysterically, clutching my coat as if I were the only solid thing left in her entire crumbling universe. "Dad," she wept, her voice muffled against my chest. "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything." I just held her, stroking the back of her head gently, letting her release months of built-up terror, guilt, and profound regret. "You are safe now, Jada," I murmured softly, resting my cheek against her hair. "I told you I would protect my grandson, and I meant it." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a newfound profound understanding of exactly who her father really was, and the immense lengths I would go to ensure her safety. I looked back at her, wiping a smudge of grease and dirt from her tear-stained cheek. "Power is not for showing off at fancy dinner parties, Jada," I said, my voice steady and filled with absolute, undeniable truth. "It is not for buying expensive sports cars or trying to impress arrogant strangers with fake status. True power is used exclusively to protect your family in moments exactly like this." The morning after the terrifying alleyway confrontation, Jada did not sleep in. She woke up with a singular, crystal-clear purpose driving her every action. She spent the next few weeks meticulously severing every remaining toxic tie to her fabricated past. She finalized the sale of her last few designer items, wringing every possible dollar out of her former wardrobe, and used those funds to aggressively pay off her own minor personal debts. She officially filed the paperwork to drop Blake's surname, permanently restoring her maiden name and reclaiming her true identity. She packed up her son's belongings and officially moved back into my townhouse, completely abandoning the fake illusion of the Buckhead elite. Once her personal life was entirely stabilized, she put on a simple, inexpensive business suit and drove directly to the towering glass headquarters of Hayes Holdings. She walked into my top-floor office not as a privileged daughter expecting a lucrative family handout, but as a humbled woman seeking a genuine chance to rebuild her professional life from the ground up. She stood respectfully before my massive mahogany desk and asked for a position within the company. She told me she wanted to learn the family business from the inside out, to truly understand the empire I had built with my own 2 hands, and to prove her worth through actual hard work. I looked at her from across my desk, evaluating her earnest request with the cold, detached objectivity of a corporate chairman. I saw the genuine determination burning in her eyes, but I also knew that handing her a high-level executive position would completely ruin the crucial lesson she was currently learning. I leaned back in my leather chair and gave her my uncompromising terms. I told her I would absolutely not hire her as a director, a senior manager, or even a junior financial analyst. If she truly wanted to work at Hayes Holdings, she would have to start at the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder. I offered her a position as a front desk receptionist down on the ground floor lobby, earning a standard entry-level base salary. I made it crystal clear there would be no nepotism bonuses, no luxurious corner office, and absolutely no special treatment from the management team. She would answer the constantly ringing phone lines, organize the dense filing cabinets, and brew coffee for the senior executives every single morning. I waited for the familiar flash of indignation, or the arrogant pushback I would have expected from her just a few months prior. But it never came. Jada did not argue, complain, or try to aggressively negotiate better terms. She simply nodded, accepted the harsh conditions without a flinch, and asked what time she needed to clock in for her very first shift. The very next morning, Jada took her place behind the sleek marble reception desk in the main lobby. She swallowed her immense lingering pride and threw herself entirely into the grueling, mundane work. She rapidly learned how to route complex international calls, manage aggressive vendor schedules, and coordinate massive executive board meetings without making errors. She brewed the morning coffee, ensuring every senior partner had exactly what they needed before the chaotic business day began. She took the crowded public commuter train to work every single day, packing a homemade lunch in a paper bag to save her meager hourly wages. Whenever she made a mistake, she owned it immediately and corrected it without making defensive excuses. She listened intently to the seasoned brokers and elite analysts as they passed through the lobby, absorbing the intricate language of commercial real estate. She was no longer performing for a fake social circle of wealthy housewives. She was grinding daily, building thick calluses on her hands and fortifying her character. She watched how hard the everyday employees worked to feed their families, and a profound, deep-seated respect for honest labor completely replaced her former superficial arrogance. 2 entire years passed in a blur of relentless, disciplined hard work. The transformation in my daughter was absolutely remarkable. She was no longer the naive, vulnerable woman who could be easily manipulated by flashy cars or fake smiles. The grueling hours behind the reception desk had forged her into a sharp, highly observant, and fiercely independent professional. She eventually earned a well-deserved promotion to a junior project coordinator role, not because she was the boss's daughter, but because her department manager specifically requested her due to her flawless organizational skills and relentless work ethic. She managed her modest salary with extreme precision, saving a substantial portion every month and securing her son's future without ever asking me for a single dime of financial assistance. She learned how to read complex financial spreadsheets, spot subtle market trends, and accurately evaluate commercial property values. But more importantly, she learned the absolute paramount value of loyalty. She saw firsthand how I treated my employees with respect, and how that respect was returned in the form of fierce, unwavering dedication to the company. She understood that true lasting wealth was built on solid foundations of trust and integrity, not on empty promises and highly leveraged debt. The dark ghost of her disastrous marriage faded into a distant memory, replaced entirely by the strong, capable woman she had successfully molded herself into. She finally understood the true weight and power of a single dollar earned through honest sweat. She stood tall in meeting rooms, holding her own against seasoned contractors and demanding clients. Her confidence was no longer a fragile mask, but a solid armor forged in the fires of actual experience and hard-won competence. However, the dark ghosts of our past were not completely buried. Richard and Victoria Kensington had spent the last 2 years quietly seething in the humiliating shadow of their massive financial defeat. I had effectively forced their failing enterprise into a tight corner, allowing them to barely survive, but keeping them entirely under my strict financial control. Driven by a bitter, festering hatred over their son's lengthy prison sentence, they decided to launch a desperate, cowardly counterattack. Knowing they could never defeat Hayes Holdings in a legitimate, transparent business arena, they resorted to vicious, illegal market manipulation. They hired anonymous offshore proxy firms to aggressively spread fake, highly damaging rumors about our financial stability to key institutional investors across the country. They fabricated convincing documents suggesting Hayes Holdings was secretly facing massive federal tax audits and impending bankruptcy, hoping to trigger a massive panic sell-off and completely tank our corporate valuation. They operated in total secrecy, believing their elite connections and hidden digital tracks would shield them from discovery. But they made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. They completely forgot about Jada. One evening, while attending a mandatory commercial real estate networking event downtown, Jada bumped into an old acquaintance from her former Buckhead social circle. This friend, heavily intoxicated and eager to share exclusive gossip, carelessly let slip a few highly specific details about a massive whisper campaign being quietly funded by the Kensington family to destroy a major Atlanta trust. Jada's sharp, newly trained analytical mind instantly connected the dots. She realized immediately that her former in-laws were actively trying to orchestrate the total financial destruction of my empire. She did not panic or rush to confront the gossiping friend. She politely excused herself from the conversation, her heart pounding with a cold, calculating focus, as she quietly formulated her own plan to completely neutralize the Kensington family once and for all. Jada left the downtown networking event with her heart pounding, but her mind remained razor-sharp and calculating. 2 years ago, a threat of this magnitude would have sent her spiraling into a blind panic. She would have run straight to my townhouse, crying and begging me to deploy my corporate lawyers to fix the problem. Not anymore. The woman who had spent the last 24 months scrubbing coffee pots, answering relentless phone calls, and meticulously reviewing thousands of dense vendor contracts had evolved into an entirely different creature. She decided in that very moment that she was not going to run to her father for a bailout. She was going to handle the Kensington family threat entirely on her own. She returned to her modest desk at the Hayes Holdings headquarters late that night and logged into our highly secure financial databases. She utilized the advanced forensic accounting and data analysis skills she had painstakingly honed over the past 2 years. She knew exactly how arrogant families like the Kensingtons operated. They believed they were untouchable, so they were often incredibly sloppy, leaving massive digital footprints hidden just beneath shallow layers of outdated corporate shell structures. Jada spent the entire weekend locked inside her home office, refusing to sleep or eat. She meticulously cross-referenced the names of the offshore proxy firms the drunken acquaintance had carelessly mentioned. She tracked global routing numbers, tracing the dark funding back to a convoluted series of dummy corporations registered in the Cayman Islands. It was a tedious, grueling, and mentally exhausting process, but her focus was absolutely unbreakable. She was no longer a naive victim waiting to be rescued by a wealthy father. She was a highly trained corporate operative methodically dismantling a lethal threat to her family's legacy. By Sunday night, she had successfully mapped out their entire illicit network. Jada did not just find concrete evidence of the malicious whisper campaign against Hayes Holdings. As she dug relentlessly deeper into the Kensingtons' tangled financial web, she uncovered something far more devastating and highly illegal. Richard and Victoria had been desperately trying to keep their sinking real estate empire afloat through blatant market manipulation and aggressive illegal insider trading. Jada found irrefutable digital proof that Richard Kensington was utilizing the exact same offshore proxy firms to artificially inflate the stock prices of his own failing commercial subsidiaries. He would pump the valuation with fake foreign investments before dumping massive blocks of shares on unsuspecting institutional investors, robbing them blind. Furthermore, she traced dozens of illegal wire transfers bouncing between their personal executive accounts and the ghost firms funding the vicious smear campaign against our company. They were deliberately defrauding their own shareholders and violating federal law just to finance a petty personal vendetta against me. Jada meticulously compiled every single wire transfer receipt, every time-stamped offshore transaction, and every piece of corrupted internal correspondence she could hack through public financial disclosures. She organized the overwhelming mountain of evidence into a precise, chronological portfolio. She did not draft a polite warning letter to their board of directors. She did not threaten them with a lengthy civil lawsuit. She bypassed the local authorities entirely, aiming directly for the absolute top. Early Monday morning, Jada printed the comprehensive dossier, securely bound it in a thick red folder, and sent it directly to the Enforcement Division of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission via a highly encrypted anonymous portal. She also mailed a physical copy directly to the federal prosecutor office in Atlanta. She knew the SEC did not play games with blatant insider trading, especially when the irrefutable evidence was handed to them on a silver platter. She had effectively armed a financial nuclear bomb and placed it directly beneath the Kensington family estate. She did not leave a single legal loophole for their expensive corporate lawyers to exploit. The evidence was absolute, undeniable, and completely destructive. She closed her laptop, took a deep breath, and calmly went back to work coordinating project schedules as if she had not just orchestrated the complete annihilation of a generational dynasty. The massive explosion happened exactly 48 hours later. Early Wednesday morning, a massive fleet of dark, unmarked federal vehicles swarmed the towering glass headquarters of Kensington Enterprises. Dozens of FBI agents wearing heavy tactical jackets stormed the building, executing a massive, uncompromising federal raid. They seized every computer, every filing cabinet, and every physical server in the entire corporate structure. Richard and Victoria Kensington were physically escorted out of their lavish executive suites in heavy steel handcuffs. Their faces were pale with absolute terror as local news helicopters hovered above, broadcasting their spectacular, humiliating downfall on live national television. Their corporate stock valuation plummeted to absolute zero in a matter of minutes. Their entire generational empire was reduced to worthless ash before lunchtime. I stood in my top-floor office with my hands clasped behind my back, watching the live news coverage on my massive wall monitor. I looked through the transparent glass partition of my boardroom and saw Jada sitting at her desk, calmly reviewing a standard construction contract. She looked up from her paperwork, caught my eye, and gave a small, knowing nod. A profound, overwhelming wave of pride washed over my entire body. My daughter had not just defended our company from a vicious attack. She had completely neutralized our greatest enemy using nothing but her own intellect, her relentless work ethic, and her sheer force of will. I walked out of my office and approached her desk. I did not offer her a simple congratulations or a pat on the back. I handed her a sleek, embossed leather folder. Inside was a finalized corporate contract officially promoting her to the position of Chief Operating Officer of Hayes Holdings. She had earned every single letter of that title through blood, sweat, and absolute loyalty. 2 weeks later, the grand executive boardroom of Hayes Holdings was filled with our senior partners, our top-tier investors, and our most trusted commercial allies. We were hosting an intimate catered reception to officially inaugurate Jada as the new Chief Operating Officer. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly triumphant. Jada stood at the head of the massive mahogany table wearing a sharp-tailored navy suit projecting absolute authority, confidence, and grace. She was giving a brilliant, compelling speech outlining her strategic vision for the future of our commercial acquisitions and urban development projects. Right in the middle of the applause, my senior executive assistant quietly slipped into the boardroom holding a secure corporate mobile phone. She walked directly up to Jada and whispered urgently in her ear, interrupting the celebration. Jada's professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing into sharp, cold slits as she listened to the assistant message. She took the phone. It was an incoming collect call originating from a maximum security state penitentiary. The automated voice operator announced that an inmate was desperately requesting to speak with her. It was Blake. He had somehow managed to bypass the prison-restricted call list, likely using a smuggled contraband phone or trading favors with other dangerous inmates. The man who had callously tried to murder me, the man who had stolen the education fund from his own son, was weeping hysterically through the static-filled receiver. He was begging Jada for a massive financial lifeline, pleading with her to send him tens of thousands of dollars for an emergency appellate lawyer. He was completely out of options, rotting away in a bleak concrete cell, and desperately trying to manipulate the woman he thought was still weak enough to save him. Jada stared at the blinking screen of the secure corporate mobile phone. The automated voice operator repeated the desperate request from the maximum security state penitentiary. The entire boardroom fell into a hushed, expectant silence. 2 years ago, she might have felt a fleeting pang of guilt or a misplaced sense of obligation toward the man she once loved. Today, she felt absolutely nothing. She did not shed a single tear, and she did not let her professional smile waver for more than a fraction of a second. She calmly shook her head, rejecting the call entirely, and handed the device directly to me. I took the phone from her steady hand. I pressed the heavy device to my ear and listened to the frantic, pathetic sobbing echoing through the static-filled line. Blake was begging for a financial lifeline, pleading for tens of thousands of dollars to hire an appellate lawyer so he could escape the consequences of his own evil actions. I did not say a single word to him. I simply pressed the red button and disconnected the call, cutting off his hysterical pleas mid-sentence. But hanging up was not enough to permanently sever the lingering shadow of his existence. He needed a final, definitive conclusion. He needed to look into the eyes of the man he tried to murder and understand that his complete destruction was absolute and irreversible. I handed the phone back to my assistant, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked out of the executive boardroom. I instructed Michael Thorne to arrange an immediate high-security visitation clearance. I was going to see my former son-in-law one last time. The maximum security state penitentiary was a bleak, imposing fortress of gray concrete and coiled razor wire situated miles away from the gleaming Atlanta skyline. I sat rigidly in the sterile, heavily monitored visitation room waiting on my side of the thick, bulletproof glass partition. The heavy steel door on the inmate side finally clanked open. 2 armed guards escorted Blake into the small enclosure. The sight of him was genuinely shocking. The arrogant, polished corporate executive who used to wear custom-tailored navy suits and expensive cologne was completely erased from existence. Blake was visibly malnourished, his cheekbones jutting out sharply against his pale, sickly skin. His once immaculate hair was thinning rapidly, falling out in uneven patches due to the sheer crushing stress of his brutal environment. He wore an oversized, faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off his shrunken, defeated frame. When he saw me sitting across from him, his sunken eyes widened in a mix of profound terror and desperate, pathetic hope. He scrambled into the metal chair, grabbing the black plastic telephone receiver with violently trembling hands. I slowly picked up my receiver, holding it to my ear. "Terrence," he sobbed, his voice a hollow, raspy whisper. "Thank God you came. Please, you have to help me. I am dying in here. They treat me like an animal. I made a mistake, I know I did, but I do not deserve this. Please just give me a loan for an appeals lawyer. I will sign anything you want. I will confess to whatever you need. Just get me out of this concrete box. I beg you." I stared at him through the thick, smudged glass. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel the urge to yell or mock his pathetic, ruined state. My voice was incredibly low, entirely devoid of emotion and sharp as a scalpel. "You called me just the driver," I stated, my words cutting cleanly through his hysterical sobbing. "Do you remember that night, Blake? You tossed your keys at my chest in front of 70 elite guests and ordered me to park your car like a servant. You thought you were insulting me. You thought you were putting me in my proper place." Blake swallowed hard, fresh tears streaming down his hollow cheeks, but he could not look away from my unwavering gaze. "You were absolutely right, Blake," I continued, my tone dropping to a chilling, definitive whisper. "I am the driver. I am the man holding the wheel, directing the entire destiny of my family and my empire. I steer the course and I protect the passengers. And you were nothing but a terrible, ungrateful hitchhiker who tried to hijack the vehicle. So I did exactly what a good driver does. I kicked you to the curb and I left you choking on my exhaust." I leaned slightly closer to the thick glass, ensuring my final words would haunt his every waking moment. "This is your permanent reality now. You will rot in this cage until your sentence is complete. Do not ever attempt to call my daughter or my grandson again. If you ever try to reach out to my family, I will personally ensure your remaining years in this facility are a living, breathing nightmare." I did not wait for his pathetic response. I did not want to hear another fabricated apology or another desperate plea for unearned mercy. I slowly placed the heavy black plastic receiver back onto its metal cradle, severing our communication entirely. Blake realized with absolute paralyzing clarity that his final microscopic sliver of hope had just been completely extinguished. He dropped his receiver and slammed his open palms violently against the thick bulletproof glass. He screamed my name, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated agony and utter despair. His muffled shrieks barely penetrated the heavy, soundproof barrier between us. He clawed frantically at the partition, scratching his fingernails against the impenetrable surface, as if he could somehow dig his way out of the horrific reality he had built for himself. The 2 armed guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing him aggressively by the shoulders and dragging him backward away from the glass. I did not stay to watch the rest of his humiliating meltdown. I stood up from the metal chair, smoothed the lapels of my dark wool coat, and turned my back on him forever. I walked out of the sterile visitation room, the heavy steel doors locking decisively behind me with a loud metallic clank. I navigated the long, gray corridors, passing through multiple security checkpoints until I finally pushed open the heavy front doors of the penitentiary. I stepped out into the bright, warm afternoon sun. I closed my eyes and took a massive, deep breath of the fresh, unburdened air. The heavy, toxic shadow that Blake Kensington had cast over my family was officially and permanently lifted. We were entirely free. I walked down the long concrete path toward the visitor parking lot. I had not called for my personal driver today. I had not requested the black Rolls-Royce Maybach or the armed security escort. Sitting perfectly parked in the corner of the asphalt lot was my 1998 Ford F-150. The faded paint caught the late afternoon sunlight, and the minor rust spots gleamed like proud battle scars. The very same truck Blake had once called poverty stock in front of his wealthy fake friends. The very same truck he had crawled underneath in the dead of night to sabotage. My trusted mechanic had fully repaired the severed brake lines and restored the vehicle to perfect working condition. I walked up to the driver's side door, unlocked it, and pulled myself up onto the familiar worn leather seat. I gripped the heavy steering wheel, feeling the rough texture beneath my palms. I slid the metal key into the ignition and turned it firmly. The old engine roared to life, instantly vibrating with a deep, powerful, and incredibly reliable hum. A genuine contented smile spread slowly across my face. The billionaire chairman of Hayes Holdings shifted the old transmission into drive and pulled smoothly out of the prison parking lot. I drove the old rusted truck back toward the city, heading straight for my quiet, comfortable townhouse. Inside that home, my brilliant, successful daughter and my young, healthy grandson were waiting for me to join them for a warm family dinner. As the sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the highway, I drove forward into the peaceful night. It was a complete, triumphant, and utterly ruthless ending. The ultimate lesson we can take from this story is that true power never needs to announce itself. Arrogance and superficial wealth are merely fragile masks worn by the weak to hide their profound insecurities. When you judge someone by the clothes they wear or the vehicle they drive, you blind yourself to their actual strength and character. Real resilience is forged in silence through hard work, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to protect the people you love. Never underestimate the quiet ones, because they are usually the ones holding the ultimate power to dictate the outcome. If you love this story of absolute karma, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments how you would handle someone like Blake.